Chapter 39. So much. Jura couple was stunned. 1 silver coin was equal to 100 copper coins, and Gray's monthly salary was about 2 silver coins. As for Jura, her salary was slightly higher, but it was only about 3 silver coins. She would only get some extra commission if she occasionally visited a rich family or a lord. 10 silver coins was basically equivalent to 2 months of salary for them. What do you want so much money for? Gray frowned. The task needs it. After the task is over, I will return it to you. Dean said seriously. Jura and Gray looked at each other and said helplessly, Well, it is your celebration fee, but you have to promise me that you will not use it to do bad things. Dean breathed a sigh of relief. He knew that the money was indeed a lot. Jura and Jura were willing to give it to him because of his identity as a guard. Otherwise, how could an ordinary child get 2 months' salary from their parents without telling them the reason? The next day, Dean went out early in the morning and went to the Adventurers' Bazaar in the southern residential district with 10 silver coins in his pocket. Whether it was the slums, the residential district, or the commercial district, they were divided into 4 regions: east, west, south, and north. Each region was extremely vast. Dean lived in Lin Kong Street, which was located in the southeast of the residential district. The so-called Adventurers' Bazaar was a free trade market for civilians outside of the Chamber of Commerce. The goods here were found by civilians in the outer edge of the residential district near the giant wall. In the outer edge, the nuclear radiation was dense in the air. Only some adventurers were willing to go there. But adventurers often didn't last long. Generally, they retired after a few times and used the money they earned to support their body. However, Dean didn't have to worry about the nuclear radiation there. He had checked the information. He had received a set of black standard soft armor made of lead. Lead was a very dense metal that could effectively resist radiation, so he could freely enter and exit the outer edge of the giant wall. After all, compared with the outside of the giant wall, the radiation in the outer edge was not worth mentioning. However, although he had the protection of the uniform, he would breathe in the polluted air. Moreover, the outer edge was too far away from the residential district. It was not a small price to hire a carriage. In addition, there were animals eroded by radiation. It was very dangerous. Dean was too lazy to waste time going there. After spending 5 copper coins, Dean came to the Adventurers' Bazaar. There were a lot of carriages coming and going. It was very lively. He could hear the noise of hawking from far away. The ground was covered with a variety of things. Some were homemade clothes and dolls, some were strange colored stones, and some were dried rare animal meat. Dean strolled along the aisle. Half an hour later, he finally found a few pieces of crude sulfur, ore, and white ice like saltpeter in front of a stall. As for charcoal powder, he could make it himself and didn't need to waste money to buy it. The owner was a middle-aged man with dark skin and a withered body. His hair was messy and his eyes were sunken. There were some red spots on his hands, as if he was infected with some kind of disease. Even though they were covered by his long sleeves, they were still revealed when he raised his hands. Dean knew that the person's body had a very high radiation value. Most likely, he would not live for more than a few years unless he got treatment from the Holy Church. After some bargaining, Dean finally bought all the saltpeter and sulfur ore at the stall for 1 silver coin and 20 copper coins. The saltpeter was more valuable, so he spent 1 silver coin. This sulfur ore has to be refined by myself. After the refined sulfur is ground into powder, it should only be enough to make a bag of explosives. In addition, when I go out to scavenge, I'm not allowed to bring anything other than food and basic weapons. I can't bring much black gunpowder, so I'll buy this for the time being. Dean calculated in his heart. Little guy, these things are very heavy. Do you want to call a carriage or your family's adults to help you? Do you want me to help you carry it? The middle-aged man said with a smile after receiving the money. No need. Dean picked up the linen bag. The bag weighed about 20 pounds, but it was as light as nothing in his hands. He turned around and continued to look for grinding tools. The middle-aged man slightly opened his mouth and blinked his eyes. It didn't take long for Dean to buy some basic alchemy tools from other stalls. In the eyes of ordinary people, these tools naturally had nothing to do with alchemy. For example, the stone wheel that Dean used to grind sulfur was generally used by doctors to grind hard drugs. After buying almost everything, Dean strolled around the market. By the way, he knew what materials were available here. If there was a need in the future, he could directly come here by. At noon, Dean turned around and was ready to go back to eat. "Boss, this broken stone. Sell it to me for 1 copper coin, please." Suddenly, a tender boy's voice sounded. Dean looked to the side and saw a stout boy who was half a head shorter than him, standing in front of a stall. The boy was carrying a small linen bag in his hand and was holding a rough black stone the size of a fist. "No, no." The stall owner was a short and thin young man. He repeatedly shook his head and said, "This is iron ore. Although the weight is very small, but at least I can sell it for 2 copper coins." "Boss, even if it is iron ore, it is just an ore. It is not iron. Such a small piece can't be refined much. You can make a profit by selling it for 1 copper coin." The sturdy boy changed his strategy. "Moreover, such a small piece is not needed in the smelting factory. No one will buy it. If you sell it to me, you can make money. If no one wants to buy it, you can only throw it away." The short and skinny young man was moved by his words. He hesitated a little, but finally said, "All right." The sturdy boy grinned and happily paid the money. He put the black stone into the linen bag and turned away. Dean retracted his eyes and was about to turn away. Suddenly, he turned around and looked at the wrist of the sturdy boy who was carrying the linen bag. There was a very small black hook pattern on it. "Alchemist apprentice?" Dean was startled. He didn't expect to meet an alchemist apprentice here. In Roseyard's notes, he had learned about the lifestyle and some habits of alchemists. The most impressive point was that every alchemist would have an exclusive tattoo pattern. It was the symbol of alchemists and also one of the basic ways to enter the path of alchemist. The method of tattooing here was very old. Plants or powders were mixed with black water and injected into the skin through a needle. The outline of the pattern was arbitrary. Even if it was a small dot or a shapeless crooked line, it could be regarded as a symbol. Although in addition to alchemists, there were nobles and holy church who had mastered the method of tattooing. But their tattoos were different from alchemists. They would never use black as a pigment. Once a black tattoo was tattooed, whether it was nobles or holy church personnel, they would be treated as alchemists. It could be said that this was an absolute proof. Similarly, if you didn't have a black tattoo on your body, then even if you were a real alchemist, you wouldn't be recognized by others. Although there were a lot of things recorded, most of them were information that only senior alchemists could master. There are very few records of basic properties. However, if you want to join the circle of alchemists, you must become an alchemist. And the first step of an alchemist proof was a black tattoo. Dean didn't want to tattoo himself for the time being. He wasn't ready to join the alchemist circle so soon. After all, according to Roseyard's records, the alchemist circle used another identity to communicate with each other. The purpose of this was to avoid being exposed and arrested by the Knights of Light. Then they would be tortured to confess to the others. After I come back from outside the giant wall, I will formally consider this point. Dean looked at the alley and turned to the intersection. He stopped the carriage and went to the slums. He learned from childhood that doing many things at the same time would affect efficiency. Soon, the carriage came to the boundary of the slums. Dean jumped out of the carriage and returned to the slums. As he approached the slums, the strong smell in the air made him frown slightly. There was a trace of helplessness in his heart. He could only endure the strange smell. He went along the path to a more remote place and found a shabby, small hotel to rent. In the hotel room, Dean took out several raw materials from the linen bag. The first step was to extract the sulfur from the sulfur. He was going to use the most primitive refining method. He would use high temperature to heat the sulfur and dissolve it. He would take the upper layer of the sulfur solution and cool it down. Then he would grind it into sulfur powder using a stone wheel. Dean asked the hotel owner for a brazier. Although it was the rainy season and it was a bit strange to ask for a brazier to keep warm, but Dean gave him copper coins. The hotel owner was very happy and took out the dusty brazier from the warehouse. He also gave him a few pieces of coal. Dean went back to his room and locked the door. He used a fireside that the hotel owner gave him to ignite the coal. After burning it for a while, the fire was too weak. Dean simply bought a big bag of coal from the hotel owner. The melting point of the sulfur was not high, so it melted quickly. Dean took out the equipment that he bought in advance and began to fill the sulfur solution. The room was filled with the strange smell of sulfur. Dean was secretly glad that he was prepared. He put on a mask. Because of the nuclear radiation, the mask did not seem to disappear along with the technological fault. It has always appeared in people's lives. It has to be said that different environments promote different development. Dean thought that in the future, he would get a gas mask like Roseyard's. For alchemists, they often deal with a variety of substances. It was inevitable that some toxic substances would be ingested. The effect of the mask was negligible. It was only used by alchemy apprentices. In the evening, Dean finally finished grinding the sulfur powder and fire saltpeter. As for the charcoal, he was going to go back and make it himself. This thing was simple. I didn't expect that making the oldest black powder would be so tiring. Dean looked at his clothes that were stained with coal. He smiled bitterly. He suddenly yearned for the day when he would have his own alchemy room. I hope I can make a lot of money outside the giant wall. Dudian wiped the dust on his face, but his fighting spirit was high. In the blink of an eye, 7 days passed. The night before the mission, Dean said goodbye to Jura and Jura. Under their watchful eyes, he sat in the black carriage sent by the Melon Consortium's scavenger headquarters. He returned to the commercial district and lived in the previous castle. Mason and the others were also brought along with him, as well as other scavengers who had graduated together with him. I heard that we will leave early in the morning. Mason excitedly said, "Tomorrow we can go outside the giant wall. When I was a child, I wanted to see it, but I was scared by the terrible stories that they told me. Save it. Although the outside of the giant wall is not as terrible as they said, but it is absolutely dangerous." Zach said. Sham smiled as he looked at the things that Dudian had placed on the bedside. "Dean, what did you bring?" "Toy," Dean casually said. He glanced at the black powder tube that he had made in the past 7 days. He thought that since it was packaged like this, it was impossible not to carry it. Chapter 41. The next morning, at dawn, Dean and others were woken up and gathered outside the castle. There were more than a dozen black horses parked here. Dean already knew that these black horses were called black-toothed horses. They had strong disease resistance and could move outside the giant wall for a short time. Get on the horses and get ready to set off. Peter, who was riding on a tall horse, looked like an elegant knight as he commanded. Dean and others each picked a black-toothed horse and jumped on it. If their bodies were not strengthened, then they would have to borrow a ladder to ride such a big horse. But now they only needed to borrow a slight force to get on the horse. "Go!" Peter shouted. His legs clamped the horse's abdomen and took the lead. Dean and the others pulled the reins and followed closely behind. These black-toothed horses were professionally trained, so they were not as terrible as their appearance. They were obedient and very easy to control. There was still some wet fog in the early morning streets. The sound of horse hooves was very clear. Under the leadership of Peter, Dean and others galloped along the street and gradually went to the outer edge of the commercial district. The vague outline of the giant wall in the distant horizon gradually became clear. The black shadow in the morning fog was like a giant beast crawling, giving people an indescribable sense of awe and oppression. In the outer edge of the commercial district, like the residential district, there were large areas of uncultivated wasteland. The land was desolate, mainly sandy and wasteland. It was not suitable for cultivation and naturally not suitable for people to live in. As they stepped into the desolate radiation zone of the outer edge, the black-toothed horses became restless. It was both excited and manic. Their speed suddenly accelerated. After walking straight for more than 10 minutes, the Sylvia giant wall behind the hazy morning mist gradually became clear in everyone's field of vision. As it became clearer and clearer, the huge black pressure was also deeply imprinted in everyone's heart. This was a giant wall so tall that the top could not be seen. The closer they got, the more they couldn't see the height of the giant wall. It was as if it led to the depths of the clouds. The thick wall was natural, as if it was built by a god. There was no trace of construction at all. It was like a complete natural boulder. This was the giant wall. Including Dean, everyone was shocked. When they came to the front of the giant wall, they only felt that they had become as small as ants. Compared to the giant wall, they were like grains of sand. So high. Mason looked up. His neck was almost 90 degrees, but he still couldn't see the top of the giant wall. Zach asked, This is the giant wall built by our ancestors. Everyone was shocked by this great and magnificent project. Dean had the deepest feeling. He was very clear that it was a great thing to build such a giant wall in front of him. Even in the old era, it was an extremely difficult thing to do. It required countless manpower and time. The outbreak of the disaster was extremely sudden. There was no time for people to build such a super shelter. He couldn't imagine that those who survived the nuclear explosion could build such an incredible architectural miracle. This is the Sylvia giant wall that protects us. It was built by our ancestors and the gods. There was a trace of pride in Peter's eyes. He turned to look at the crowd and smiled. Come with me, little guys. He gently pulled the rope and approached the giant wall. He stopped when he was about 100 meters away from the giant wall. He turned over and dismounted. He looked around on the ground and soon saw the target. He bent down and lifted it. Squeak! The heavy iron door was pulled open. They saw that there was a huge iron door under the sand. Peter's amazing arm strength lifted it. Below the iron door was a staircase leading to the underground. Go in, Peter said. Everyone was surprised, but quickly dismounted and entered the tunnel under the iron door. Peter was the last one to come in. He closed the iron door. Everyone suddenly felt isolated from the world. They couldn't help but panic. They saw that the tunnel in front of them extended into the darkness. It seemed to lead to hell. There was a faint oil lamp on the wall. A trace of cold air gushed out from the tunnel. It was accompanied by a whistling sound, as if the ghosts were crying. Aren't we going outside the giant wall? A girl looked back and timidly said. Peter smiled and said, What's wrong? Are you afraid now? It seems that Tobu didn't train your courage in the last 3 years. Dudian asked, Are we going outside the giant wall from here? Isn't it from above? Is there a door? Of course not. Peter urged, Hurry up. Everyone is waiting for you. Dudian was surprised. Is there someone else? Of course, although you are formal scavengers, but after all, it is the first time for you to go outside the giant wall. The headquarters has arranged 2 seniors to guide you. In addition, according to the usual practice, there are 20 consortium training scavengers in your team. Although some of their professional knowledge is slightly lacking compared to you, but they have been outside the giant wall many times. Their experience is richer than yours. At the critical time, you have to learn modestly. Peter laughed. Dudian froze for a moment, but didn't say anything. At this time, everyone went down the stairs. The stairs were deep beyond imagination. It was at least hundreds of meters deep. When they finally reached the bottom, there was a spacious underground passage in front of them. The passage was quiet. The oil lamps on both sides were shining, reflecting some stone patterns on the wall. This is the goddess of harvest, Tyke. Peter pointed to an elegant and graceful woman on the wall. You have to pray well. I wish you a fruitful trip. Dean and others were familiar with the statues of the goddess of harvest in the square of the Holy Church and some intersections of the residential areas. They stopped in front of the goddess of harvest, clasped their hands together, and bowed their heads to pray. This is the goddess of the hunt. Peter pointed to another valiant and stunning woman next to him. Every time hunters go out, they will worship the goddess of the hunt to bless them with a smooth hunt. He took the lead and walked forward. Dudian and others finished praying and followed behind him. The spacious underground passage was extremely long, about 200 or 300 meters in length. At the end of the passage was the same stairs. Everyone went up the stairs. It didn't take long for them to reach the top of the stairs. There was also a huge iron door. At the moment, it was open like a skylight. Dudian followed Peter out and saw a desolate, withered grass. More than 20 figures were sitting or standing more than 10 meters away. You're finally here. Peter, you're really slow. At this time, A chuckle came from a youth wearing black soft armor. He was tall and straight. There was a 2-foot sword on his waist. He was wearing a black mask. Peter laughed. "What's the hurry? It's still early." The youth smiled and glanced at Dudian and others. "I heard that there is a good seed among the newcomers. Is it possible that he will become a hunter?" Peter raised his hand and patted Dudian's shoulder. "That's him. I will trouble you to take care of him." The youth looked at Dudian and laughed. "No problem. It's getting late. We have to go. When we come back, we will find you for a drink. Remember to treat us." "Every time I have to treat you, you miser." Peter laughed and said to Dudian and others, "I wish you all the best. Remember not to act without authorization. Don't leave the team. I hope to see everyone come back safely after 10 days." Then he turned into the underground passage and left. Chapter 42. My name is Scott. This is my partner, Mia. After Peter left, the youth pointed to a tall and slender woman next to him. He said to Dean and others, "We will be the captains of this operation for the next 10 days. It's best for everyone to listen to my commands. If there's a mess, then it's not good for everyone. Moreover, there will be no small punishment when we return to the consortium." Hearing the punishment, Macon, Zach, and several other surly children immediately became obedient and obediently promised. Scott looked at Dudian. "Little guy, what's your name?" "Dudian." "Good potential." Scott nodded slightly, "But don't be arrogant. In front of death, potential is meaningless. You will follow behind me. I will tell you some things that you need to pay attention to." "Is he going to teach me step by step?" Dudian could not help but have a good impression of this person. He nodded slightly to show that he understood. The people behind them heard this. They knew that Scott was going to focus on training Dudian. For a time, many of them were secretly jealous, but they didn't say anything. After all, Dudian's identity as a seed was there. Moreover, he had obtained 2 blessings. Whether it was force or identity, they couldn't shake him. Moreover, there were 3 dormitory brothers behind Dudian. They were the strongest and most united group in their group. Even the grumpy children who didn't care about the consequences didn't dare to provoke Dudian, Mason, Zach, and Shay. "Well, this is your food and water for the next 10 days. This time I have brought it for you. Next time you go to the headquarters to get it." Scott pointed to more than a dozen black backpacks on the ground. Dudian looked at the black traveler's backpack. He picked one up and untied the rope. He saw that the backpack was filled with mud balls. He had seen them in Jura's house. They were mashed potato balls. The taste was very bad, but it was easy to fill. In other words, after eating one, he wouldn't have the appetite to eat the second one. Mason, Zach, and Shay followed behind Dudian. They quickly picked up 3 backpacks that looked a little bigger. Scott laughed as he saw that the people behind him also wanted to learn from the 3 of them. "Don't choose. It's the same weight. It's given by the headquarters. There's never a mistake. Use your little cleverness later." Mason, Zach, and Sham smiled in embarrassment. "What is this?" At this time, Scott noticed the black powder tube on Dudian's waist. "It's not worth mentioning." Dean said, "It won't hinder me." Scott nodded and didn't say anything else. He turned to the 20 consortium scavengers in the distance and said, "Gather here and prepare to depart." The 20 consortium scavengers were adults with dark skin. Some of them were older than Scott. Scott had summoned all of them. Their standard soft armor was the same as Dudian's. Obviously, the consortium's powerful financial resources were able to guarantee the supply of these hardware equipment. "Boss Ku, which district are we going to today?" a skinny youth asked. "Zone 8. Scott turned to the silent, black-armored woman, Mia, and said, "It's getting late. Shall we go?" Mia nodded slightly. Scott waved his hand and took the lead in the front. He said to Dudian and other newcomers, "The outer edge has been completely cleared. You don't have to worry about anything. Save your strength." Dudian and others thought that Scott was right. Their tight muscles gradually relaxed as they looked around the surrounding environment. There was a wasteland nearby. The ground was quite humid. Dudian had previously noticed that there were a lot of moss on the giant wall. It was completely different from the sandy terrain behind the giant wall. "Is this the outside of the giant wall?" "It's completely different from what I imagined." I thought that everywhere was a desert. Mason, who was behind Dudian, looked around in surprise. Zach laughed. We don't have to worry about the water problem. We can find a place to dig a hole and squeeze out water. Scott heard his words and glanced back at him. There are puddles everywhere on ground. You don't need to dig a hole to find water. I'm afraid you won't dare to drink. Huh? Zach was stunned. Dudian saw that Scott didn't explain, so he said to him, the radiation outside the giant wall is too high. Even if the water is filtered by the soil, it is not drinkable. If you want to drink water, you have to dig at least tens of meters deep. The difficulty of digging a few meters in the desert is the same as digging a few meters in the desert. It is a waste of physical strength, so we have to save a lot of water. Hearing Dudian's words, Zach and several other children had a puzzled expression on their faces. Scott looked back at Dudian, but didn't say anything. He continued to lead the way in front. After walking for more than 10 miles, they suddenly came to a place with less vegetation on the ground. To be precise, they came to a ruin. Dudian was stunned as he saw the ruins. This was a broken city? In front of him was an asphalt street, but the street was covered with moss and lush vegetation. There were concrete high-rise buildings on both sides of the street. There were 2 or 3-story shops, but at the moment, all of them had collapsed and broken. There was only a crumbling wall that was isolated. It was covered with vines and moss. It seemed that after a few years, it would be completely buried by these dense growth of plants. There were some broken clothes scattered on the desolate street. These messy clothes were obviously very old. They were soaked by the rain and covered with dust. They had long turned into hard and black stone-like objects. Only a rough shape and outline could be seen. Dudian was completely stunned. This was the appearance of a ruined city. Could it be that this was what Earth would look like 300 years after the catastrophe? Once the prosperity, the lights of civilization, the footprints of human beings all over the Earth. Was it like the ruins in front of him, leaving only empty shells after the disaster? He suddenly felt that his chest was blocked by something. He couldn't breathe. His eyes were moist. Dean. Mason saw Dudian suddenly stop and could not help but pat his shoulder. Dudian recovered and saw that Scott and Mia had walked into the street in front of him. He quickly followed them. However, when his feet stepped onto the asphalt street that was covered by vegetation, his heart was filled with all sorts of feelings. The longing for his parents and sister was like a flame that crawled into his mind. However, he was very sorrowfully aware that those who had passed could never come back. This was the reality, just like the reality of the ruins in front of him. This is area number 9. It has been scavenged. Scott saw that the people behind didn't keep up in time. He turned back and waved. Hurry up. Don't waste your life. Dudian slightly pursed his lips and bowed his head to keep up with him. Along the way, Dudian saw that the street had been scavenged very clean. Basically, in addition to the collapsed houses, there was nothing left. In such a spacious street, there should be many scrap cars, but he didn't see a single one. Obviously, as Scott said, they had been scavenged. But why the technology inside the giant wall was so backward even after the old era's technology had been picked up? Was it because of the serious nuclear radiation corrosion for 300 years that there was no research value? Chapter 43. Were there people living here before? Mason, Zach, Sand, and others looked at the ruined walls on both sides of the street covered with vegetation. They were surprised. From the traces of the broken walls, they could see that there were residential buildings, but the architectural style was very different. Of course, Scott looked up at the surrounding ruins. This is the place where our ancestors used to live. But the disaster has invaded, and now it is desolate. However, there are still things left behind by our ancestors here. Our role is to bring these things back and hand them over to the consortium, the place where our ancestors lived. Mason and others were excited as they heard Scott's words. They curiously looked at everything around them. Dean saw a sheepskin map in Scott's hand. He looked around the gap between Scott's arms and saw a crooked route on the map. In the center, there was a huge square pattern with the words Sylvia's Giant Wall written on it. Outside the giant wall, there were irregular circles outlined by curved lines. There were numbers marked on the top of the circle. 0. Number 1. Dean glanced at the map and found that the numbers were repeated. There were 6 or 7 symbols in the 0 area. However, these symbols and circles were outlined in different colors. It was as gorgeous as a rainbow. Scott saw that Dean was looking at the map, so he smiled. This is the scavenging map outside the giant wall. Each consortium's hunters will mark the area after they have swept it. Our Melon Consortium's area is marked with red lines and handwriting. Other green and yellow areas belong to other consortiums. There are records on the back of the map. Green represents the military and yellow represents the Huashan Consortium. Dean nodded slightly. He had already guessed it when he saw these circles with different colors. He asked, "What is the gray area outside?" "This is the place that the hunters haven't swept yet." Scott smiled and said in a serious tone, "You must not step into these gray areas. It is extremely dangerous. Even the hunters may die." "Dangerous?" Dean was curious. "What kind of danger?" "Monsters," Scott whispered. Dean's heart jumped. "Monsters?" At this time, Scott passed a corner. There was a collapsed traffic light on the street, but it was covered with vegetation and entangled with many vines. So it wasn't collected by the scavengers. Zone 8 is just ahead. Scott looked at the street in front of the corner. It was still in ruins, but because it was close to the center of the city, there was less vegetation. A large number of broken walls and collapsed houses were all exposed. The desolate street was damaged by the aftermath of the earthquake. The street was cracked, and there were many deep craters on the ground that looked like small meteorites. "Everyone, be careful." Scott looked dignified as he pulled out the dagger from his waist and said, "The 8th area is the area that the hunter just cleared. We are the second team to enter this area. Although the harvest will be very rich, but it is very likely that we will encounter some small monsters. Don't let them attack you, or you will be infected." Dean, Macon, and other newcomers couldn't help but feel nervous. They learned from Scott and pulled out their weapons. They vigilantly scanned the surrounding environment and the fluffy vegetation near the street. Dean followed Scott into the middle of the street. He saw a new wooden road sign on the side of the road. There was a blood-red word, number 8, written on it. It meant that the area in front of them was under the control of the Melon Consortium. Dean looked at the street in front of him. It was obvious that the street hadn't been cleaned. He could vaguely see lumps of green vegetation. From the outline, it seemed that there were scrap cars under the vegetation. His heart jumped. If there were cars, then naturally there would be generators. Although after more than 300 years, these things had long been reduced to scrap iron under the rain and ultraviolet rays. But maybe he could find some well-preserved parts. Scott said in a low voice, "There are some large resources hidden under these green plants. We'll think of a way to bring them back when we return. First, we'll find a place to stay and use it as our base camp for the next 10 days. After that, we'll split up and search for resources." Saying that, he walked past the abandoned cars covered in green plants. Dean and the 20 consortium scavengers followed them. No one noticed that one of the cars was covered with thick plants. A pale and withered hand was struggling to grab the people who had gone far away. At the end of the street, there was a crossroads. There were collapsed street lamps and huge billboards on the ground, but they had long been covered with vegetation. Scott looked up and chose a 3-story building that was relatively intact. He said, "This is it. First, clean up the materials inside and gather them." After saying that, he led the team to the 3-story building. "Ah!" A girl behind Dean's team exclaimed. She pointed to the ground in front of the building and trembled. "Blood, blood!" Everyone looked at the ground. There was a pool of blood, although it had dried up, but from the color it was obvious that it was left recently. After all, the blood on the ground couldn't stay for long under the washing of the rain. Dean's face slightly changed. He thought of the monster that Scott had mentioned. He subconsciously grasped the gunpowder at his waist. The other children were nervous as they saw the blood on the ground. Scott frowned. "What's the fuss about? I told you that there are monsters in these places. This is obviously the blood of the hunter who killed the monster. Don't be surprised again, rookie." His patience towards the other new scavengers was obviously not as high as his patience towards Dean. Mia, who was next to him, came forward and pushed the door of the building. The door was made of glass, but the glass had long been broken. It seemed to be a shop. Although the vegetation had spread all over the walls, there was still a simple layout and a few counters. Dean followed Scott into the shop. He saw that the ground and walls of the broken shop were covered with thick dust. The dust had accumulated over a long period of time. Scott used the hilt of his dagger to push away the vegetation on the counter. He saw some dusty gold jewelry in the glass cabinet. Scott's eyes lit up. He immediately used the hilt of his dagger to break the glass and grab the jewelry inside. He used his clothes to wipe off the dust, revealing the golden luster. He bit his teeth. His face was full of surprise again. Chapter 44. It's gold. Mason, Zach, and others also noticed the jewelry on the counter. Their faces showed a bit of excitement. The smile on Scott's face disappeared when he heard their words. He faintly turned his head and said, "Let me make it clear first. Although we are a team, the materials we pick up are counted separately. This has always been the rule. I'm not deliberately bullying you." He pointed at the 20 consortium scavengers. Mason and others' faces changed as they turned to look at him. They saw the consortium scavengers were led by a skinny youth. He nodded and said, "Yes, the materials we pick up are all based on our ability. So don't think about being lazy. Whoever is lucky enough to pick up the most is the one who has the ability." Mason and others were frustrated. There was no doubt that Scott was the first to find the gold jewelry. Naturally, it was his materials. They couldn't get any commission. Dudian was disappointed as he heard the rules. But he soon cheered up. The rules were actually fair for the newcomers. At least the materials they picked up wouldn't be shared with others. Scott was lucky enough to randomly pick a place to stay. It happened to be a gold shop, so he made a lot of money. At this time, Scott smashed all the glass on the cabinet. He pulled out all the jewelry and piled them up in one of the cabinets. Then he clenched his dagger and said, "Let's go upstairs and clean up." He thought of something and turned to Dudian and others. Everyone has picked up the materials. It's best not to try to steal or use other dirty methods to seize them. If the owner of the materials dies in the process of scavenging, then the materials he picked up will belong to the consortium and won't be shared. Dudian knew that he was warning the newcomers not to be blinded by greed. At the same time, he secretly appreciated that the consortium had set up such rules to a large extent to prevent the scavengers from killing each other in the wilderness. After hearing Scott's words, the children standing at the end of the line clenched their weapons and followed the team. Scott and Mia took the lead as they walked along the stairs. The corridor was covered with vegetation. There were cracks as thick as a finger. There were some things scattered on the ground. Although covered with thick dust and vegetation, Dudian recognized them at a glance. They were women's shoes and wallets. It seemed that they were silently telling of the riots that had taken place here. Bang! Suddenly, a middle-aged consortium scavenger stepped on the stairs and collapsed. His whole body also fell down and hit the ground. Fortunately, this was only the first floor, and he had a blessed physique, so he did not suffer any injuries. But this sudden movement scared the others. Scott looked back and frowned. "Be careful." He took the lead and went to the second floor. The corridor was dark. The ventilation windows had long been covered with vegetation. The sunlight couldn't penetrate. It was damp and dark inside. Scott took out a fire sickle and lit a torch. The dim yellow light illuminated the surroundings. He held the torch and walked in front. When he reached the first room in the corridor, he saw that the door of the room was half closed. Scott gently pushed the door open. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind blew out of the room, almost extinguishing the torch. Scott slightly lowered the torch. His other hand was holding a sword. He slowly entered the room. He saw that the floor was in a mess. The chairs were overturned, the curtains were torn in half, the windows were broken, and the vegetation was dense outside. "Katja!" Suddenly, a slight sound came from the depths of the room. Scott's face changed. He immediately raised the torch to illuminate the room. He saw that there was a bathroom in the room. The bathroom curtain had collapsed on the ground. Two pale and dry thighs were sticking out of the bathroom. As his torch shone, he immediately saw that the owner of the thighs was a woman whose face was completely rotten. The slight sound came from her chest. There was actually a huge black mouse lying on the ground, constantly gnawing on the woman's chest. Dean's pupils shrank as he saw the scene from the gap between Scott's arms. The size of the mouse was as big as a hound. Its body was covered with thick, dark hair and exuded a strong, rancid smell. Its tail was as thick as an adult's finger. It was gnawing the corpse with relish. "It's a monster!" Scott was the first to react. He roared and slashed with his sword. The huge rat that was eating the woman sensed the fire behind it. It turned its head and looked over. Its eyes were bloodshot and filled with violence. Its sharp mouth was stained with sticky blood, and a few extremely long whiskers were fluttering slightly. It seemed to notice that Scott had more people on his side. It paused for a moment, then suddenly turned around and ran into the bathroom. It stepped on the bathtub and jumped out of the window. At this time, Scott and Mia's attacks all failed. They looked at each other with lingering fear. At this time, Macon and others also noticed the movement. They heard Scott's words and gathered around. Scott whispered, "It escaped." Then he put down the torch and shined it on the dead woman. The woman seemed to have died with her eyes wide open. Her pupils were light green as she stared at him. "It stinks," Macon said while covering his nose. Dean forgot to breathe. His heart was full of shock. Could it be that after 300 years of nuclear radiation, the genes of the mice that lived here had mutated to such a terrible degree? His gaze landed on the woman. She was completely naked, and her body was covered by the bathroom curtain. The stiff flesh around her chest had been gnawed deeply by the rat, and even half of her heart had been bitten off. Her ribs could be seen mixed in with the dry, hard flesh. However, his gaze landed on the woman's glabella, where there was a bloody hole the size of a finger. It was as though she had been shot by a bullet. Dean was startled for a moment. He rejected the possibility of a bullet. Instead, it was more likely that it was caused by a bow and arrow. After all, the power of a bullet could cause obvious tear and damage to the flesh around the bullet hole. However, what made him unable to understand was that if this woman had died from a bow and arrow, then she had died in the hands of a human, who would use a bow and arrow to kill her. Suddenly, he thought of a point that he had overlooked. Suddenly, his whole body's hair stood up. This woman was obviously taking a bath, but the water system in this house should have been broken long ago. Whether the other side was a scavenger or a hunter, they would never be able to endure not taking a bath for 10 days. Most importantly, people in this world would rarely take a bath like this. Is she a human from 300 years ago? Did she die in the bath? But if so, her body should have rotted long ago. Dean was startled. At this time, Mia suddenly squatted down. It seemed that she didn't want the woman to die in the wilderness. She slightly lifted the curtain to cover her body. However, when she lifted the curtain, Dean inadvertently saw that the woman's arm was actually a sharp claw. The nails turned into sharp and long thorns. 5 sharp thorns were slightly curved. It was hard to imagine how much damage would be caused by such a hand. Chapter 45. Undead, Undead. Scott murmured. There was a trace of disappointment on his face as he saw Mia carefully cover her body. He sighed. "Clean up the room. This thing must be burned, otherwise it will breed other monsters." Mia's mouth slightly moved. She silently got up and looked at the woman's rotten face. Eventually, she turned her head and started to clean up other usable materials in the room. Dean was shocked as he heard Scott's words. He could not help but ask, "What is an undead undead?" Scott looked back at Mia's back. He saw her silently picking up the materials on the ground and the table. He sighed and said to Dean, "Undead undead is one of the monsters of the undead family. Their power is extremely terrible. They have night vision ability. Even if they don't eat or drink, they won't die. They like the taste of blood, so any creature that gets close to them will be eaten by them. Moreover, they will absorb the life force from the flesh and blood they eat to enhance their strength. In short, the more people or animals they eat, the more terrible they will be." Dean could not help but ask, "How did they come here?" Scott sighed. They are infected by the devil's power. These undead were human beings before their death, but they couldn't withstand the temptation of the devil's power. Eventually, they abandoned their souls. Although they got eternal life, they lost their personality and all the memories of their life. They became the devil's minions. Infected? Dean naturally did not believe in the devil's words. He asked, "Is it because of the radiation?" Scott did not expect him to get to the bottom of the matter. He looked at him and shook his head. Of course not. Radiation will only damage the body and cause some distorted changes, but it will never turn people into such monsters. They were infected by the devil's power. This power is like a plague and can spread to each other. For example, the bone-biter rat that escaped earlier is a low-level monster. Once it bites you, you will also be infected. Dean could not help but be stunned. Infect each other? Isn't this a virus? But where did this virus come from? Could it be that 300 years ago, when he was asleep, other things happened in the world? Scott sighed and said, "These rats like to hide in dark corners and are often ignored by hunters. Although we can kill them with our strength, but if we are not careful and get scratched by them, we will be infected and turn into an undead." Scott sighed and said, "These rats like to hide in dark corners and are often ignored by hunters." At this point, he glanced at Mia, who was picking up the resources, and sighed. Mia's ex-husband had his arm bitten by a steel fur rat. Clang! A metal object in Mia's hand suddenly fell to the ground. Scott sighed but didn't say anything more. He looked at Dean and others. Everyone split up and cleaned the rooms. Remember to be careful, as these monsters can smell the blood in our bodies. Although this one ran away, but it must be lingering nearby. Be careful of them hiding in the dark to attack you. It's best for the rookies to form a team of 4 and look out for each other. If anything happens, just call for help. His instructions were mainly for Dean and the other newcomers. Although the consortium scavengers were not as good as the regular scavengers, but they had come to scavenge more often. They already knew what they needed to know, so there was no need for him to explain more. Hearing Scott's order, the people at the back scattered. However, Mason, Zach, Sham, and several other children were standing in front of them. They saw the terrible appearance of the undead on the ground, as well as the huge size of the rat. Their hearts were filled with anxiety. They had never seen such a bloody scene before. For a time, the knowledge they learned in the usual training suddenly disappeared. At the moment, they just wanted to hug Scott and stick close to him. Scott looked at the pale faces of the children and slightly frowned. Scavenging is not such a simple job. Didn't your instructor tell you? If you continue to follow me, then you won't be able to pick up anything. It's equivalent to a wasted trip. You probably don't know, but if your scavenging results are ranked at the bottom several times, then you will be expelled by the consortium. Expelled? Mason, Zach, Sham, and others turned pale. They clenched their teeth and resisted the fear in their hearts. They clenched their weapons and turned to leave. Dean was about to turn to leave, but Scott shouted, "You don't have to follow them. Just follow behind me. I'll give you a third of the things I've picked up. You just have to learn how to scavenge. Next time, no one will take you." Dean frowned. "I want to see alone. If something happens, I will call for help." Scott was taken aback. He looked at him and said, "All right, be careful." Dean nodded slightly and said to Mason and the other 2, "Let's go." Mason secretly gave him a thumbs up. After they left the room, Dean saw that the other rooms on the second floor had been searched. He immediately said, "Let's go to the 3rd floor." Mason, Zach, and Sham didn't have any objection. In the course of 3 years of training, they had almost formed the habit of letting Dean have the final say. The 3rd floor was also the top floor. The vegetation was sparse. Gray and turbid sunlight shone through the gaps of the broken windows and sprinkled on the ground. There was a thick layer of dust on the floor. There were dried bloodstains on the walls. There were messy things scattered in the corridor. There were several corpses lying on the ground. Some bodies were cut at the waist, and some heads were smashed by some heavy objects. There were traces of blades on the walls. Obviously, there had been hunters here, and there had been a battle. Dean noticed that the fingers of these corpses were sharp claws. It seemed that they were infected by the virus. Although he didn't know where the virus came from, but there was no doubt that the virus had such an amazing effect. It was absolutely something that could be produced by the world's top biological research institute. It was even possible that it was created by those guys. Mason, Zach, and Sham saw the corpses on the ground. They swallowed their saliva and trembled. Although they had killed poisonous snakes, lizards, and other animals in the training, they had seen blood, but they were numb to it. But the corpses lying in front of them were human beings. They had the same life as them. This kind of fear made the three of them feel nauseous. They felt their limbs were cold. It seemed that the corpses would suddenly climb up and rush towards them to take their lives. Dean was also afraid, but he tried to keep calm. With the help of the sunlight, he came to the front of the first room. The door of the room was open. The anti-theft chain was broken. It was obvious that it had been broken by violence. There were traces of fighting in the room. There was a pool of blood on the ground. There were two corpses. It was a young man and a woman. Their skin was abnormally pale. To be precise, it was gray without blood. Faint blue veins appeared on their bodies. Their fingers were sharp. Their hands and feet were thin. It seemed that all the fat in their body had been sucked out, leaving only muscle tissue. Dean put on a scavenger's mask and immediately felt the stench was a lot lighter. His voice was a bit low through the mask. Don't touch the body. Look for other things around first. His eyes swept through the room. At a glance, he saw a laptop covered with a thick layer of dust. Chapter 46. At this time, Mason, Zach, and Sham were also searching for materials in their respective rooms. They deliberately avoided the two corpses on the ground, although they knew that the two corpses were dead, but because of this they were afraid. After searching around, Mason and the other two found some metal objects. Although they did not know the role of these objects, but in their values, as long as it was a metal object, it must be valuable. Dean saw them pick up mobile phones, TV remote controls, electric lights, and so on. His heart could not help but be curious. Scavengers should have found a lot of these things. How come the consortiums didn't study anything from them? However, when he saw the twisted metal behind the mobile phone, he suddenly understood that the 300 years in the radiation zone and the 300 years in a normal ecological environment were very different. Although these items were still there, but they have long been distorted under the accumulation of nuclear radiation. The parts were completely deformed. If one did not know the original use of these distorted parts, it was impossible to speculate useful things. The only thing that could resist the nuclear radiation was lead and gold and other high-density metals. This was why the gold jewelry on the counter had not changed much. Go to the next room. Dean swept around and did not see anything valuable. He turned and left the room. This was the advantage of going to the newly swept area to scavenge. Not only the value of the things picked up was high, but also there was room to choose. Like the rooms they had seen today, in the future there will be other scavengers who will come to sweep, but they can only pick some cloth clothes or remove the metal from the beds, refrigerators, and other large objects. Mason and the other two did not want to stay in the room with the corpses, so they immediately retreated. In the corridor, several corpses were lying quietly. It was exceptionally quiet. Dean looked at these corpses. He always felt that they would suddenly wake up. His heart was pounding. He suppressed his thoughts and opened the door of the second room. Not surprisingly, there were several corpses lying in this room. Looking at their short-sleeved clothes, it was obvious that they were people from 300 years ago. Dean had to be sure of one thing. 300 years ago, when the global nuclear bomb broke out, there was also a terrible virus disaster. This unknown virus turned all the infected people into terrible undead. Even if they stayed in the nuclear radiation zone for 300 years, they still didn't die. It could be seen how terrible and tenacious the virus in their bodies was. Dean bypassed the three corpses on the ground and searched the room for things. He was mainly looking for computers, mobile phones, and other electrical appliances. After all, in a residential house like this, the only valuable things were these things. There was a desktop computer in the room. Dean naturally would not carry the whole computer back. He disassembled the computer. The electrical box and some wires inside were full of dust. When he saw the electrical box, his heart moved. He was just about to disassemble it. Who would have thought that when his palm touched the electrical box, it was like touching a thin layer of paper easily poking into the electrical box. The electrical box had completely deteriorated after being exposed to nuclear radiation for so long. Dean sighed and looked at the other wires. The plastic outside these wires was distorted and bloated. Some of the small resistors on the motherboard were shriveled and swollen. Some of them were swollen into a strange shape. They had lost their original appearance under the nuclear radiation. Dean shook his head slightly and gave up the machine. After all, today was only the first day of scavenging. There were still 9 days left. There were many things that could be picked up, but the things he could carry were very limited. If there is a truck, I can carry as much as I want. Such an idea suddenly emerged in Dean's mind. His heart was suddenly smart, but soon he was discouraged. The scrap cars outside were obviously similar to this computer. Many parts had deteriorated or deformed and could not be repaired. If he wanted to make a mechanical transportation tool, he had to rely on the super chip. And the premise of all this was, there must be electricity. Dean turned and continued to search for other things. He only saw one way to make a generator, which was a wind generator. To make a wind generator, first of all, he needed an open field. Even if he went to the slums to buy such a field, it would cost a lot of money, so he still had to have money first. When Dean and others were searching the third room, the others also went up to the third floor and searched around. After half an hour, the building was completely searched. The goods that each person had plundered were piled up in the hall on the first floor. Everyone registered with Scott to prevent confusion and to prevent others from stealing. Obviously, in a long history of scavenging, scavengers have long understood that eliminating civil strife was the best way to get the greatest benefits. Now, everyone, go and search around the area, Scott said to everyone after he finished registering. The 20 consortium scavengers were already impatient. They immediately formed groups of 4 or 5 and left the shop to search for materials in the nearby ruins. Scott looked at Dean and said, "Mia and I are also going to search for materials. Do you want to go with us?" Dean shook his head. "No, I'll go with my friend." "All right, call for help if there is any danger. It is very quiet here, so you can basically hear everything. Just don't go too far." Scott didn't insist. Dean nodded and turned around to call Mason, Zach, and Sham. They went along the street and searched the nearby buildings. Because he knew these shops, Dean basically didn't need to go inside to know what kind of things he could find in the ruins. He didn't search every building one by one like the others, but moved along the street and soon found a small and medium-sized supermarket. The supermarket was covered with vegetation, but it was still recognizable as a supermarket from style. But he didn't know what kind of disaster it had suffered. The supermarket had collapsed from the middle. There were a few corpses lying on the ground in front of the door. So many undeads. Mason and the other 2 saw the corpses on the ground, and their faces turned ugly. They came to the 8th area, and they could see corpses everywhere. They couldn't imagine what kind of scene the hunters faced when they came here for the first time. Dean was also a little scared, but he still kept his calm. It seemed that the hunters had kicked open the door of the supermarket. Suddenly, he saw the ground was covered with corpses of the undeads. At the same time, there was a low gnawing sound. There seemed to be 7 or 8 red spots in the darkness. Mutant monsters. Dean's pupil shrank as he quickly retreated. Chapter 47. Dean hurriedly rolled sideways to avoid the attack of the gray shadow. At the same time, he looked up. It was a giant rat with pitch-black hair. It looked the same as the bone-biter rat that had escaped before, but its body was a bit thinner. At this moment, it was like a hound, baring its sharp teeth and staring at him with blood-red eyes. "Monster!" Mason, Zach, and Sand screamed. Their faces were a little pale, and their legs were a little soft. Whoosh! The bone-biter rat missed its attack. After landing, it jumped up again and pounced on Dean, who was the closest to it. Dean's hair stood up. The speed of the bone-biter rat was too fast. He had no time to dodge again. Moreover, it was the first time he faced such a battle. His brain reaction was a little slow, and he instinctively raised his arm to resist. With a bang, he felt that his upper body was hit by a heavy object. He lost his balance and fell backward, sitting on the ground. He was so scared that he instinctively wanted to close his eyes, but the last bit of reason in his heart reminded him that he would only be waiting for death if he did so. He struggled to open his eyes, only to see the bone biter rat pouncing on him. The rat's sharp mouth was extremely long, and its tiny teeth were tightly biting his arm. Panic, fear, and longing for time to stop. Save me! Save me! A lot of chaotic thoughts suddenly poured into his mind. When life encountered a desperate situation, instinct immediately completely swallowed up reason. However, this was only a momentary thought. Dean had a calm mind for a long time, so he quickly recovered his reason in panic. When he saw the bone biter rat's upper and lower jaws were constantly wriggling and chewing his arm, a sharp pain came from his arm. His heart was filled with a huge anger. Dean roared and swung his arm, smashing on the street. At the same time, he turned over and climbed up. His other hand released the dagger and grabbed the hind leg of the bone biter rat that was biting his right arm. He pulled hard, and at the same time his right arm kept hitting the ground, making its head violently hit the ground. Bang! 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 After continuous violent smashing and pulling, the bone biter rat did not persist and quickly loosened its mouth. Dean roared and shook its body, smashing on the ground. Bang! The bone biter rat hit the hard ground, and its hair and flesh offset a lot of the impact. Die for me! Die! Die! Dean roared and smashed the bone biter rat on the ground again and again. The bone biter rat's hard head collided with the ground, and its bones immediately cracked. Soon, blood spilled from the corner of the bone biter rat's mouth. As Dean swung it high, the blood spilled along the corner of its mouth like a parabola. With a bang, Dean didn't know how many times he had swung the mouse, but the anger in his heart gradually subsided. A sense of exhaustion spread through his arms. He looked at the bone biter rat that had lost its struggle, gritted his teeth, picked up the dagger on the ground, and fiercely stabbed it in the stomach. The dagger was extremely sharp. After 7 or 8 consecutive stabs, blood stained the dagger. Dean saw that the bone biter rat had completely lost its movement, so he stopped attacking. He only felt that his heart was still beating wildly. Recalling the previous frightening scene, he still had a lingering fear. This was the first time he faced fear and death. Although he had seen the most terrible doomsday, it was just the tip of the iceberg that he had seen on TV. It was like watching a disaster movie, and it was completely different from his own experience. Without looking in the mirror, Dean could feel that his face was extremely ugly at the moment, and his appearance was also extremely embarrassing. He slightly gasped and looked at his right arm. There were several deep teeth marks on it. Fortunately, the material of the black soft armor was extremely hard, and there was a layer of lead metal inside, so it was not bitten by the bone biter rat. Otherwise, the speed of infection through saliva would be much faster than other ways. He would probably become an undead like Mia's husband, that Scott said. Dean! Macon shouted in vain. Dean was startled and looked up at him, but he saw Macon suddenly rushed over, raising his dagger and chopping head-on. Dean suddenly woke up, thinking of the 7 or 8 red spots he had seen in the supermarket, and hurriedly rolled on the ground. Puff! Macon's dagger fiercely stabbed the back of Dean at the moment when he dodged. Blood sputtered out. The dagger stabbed the chest of a bone biter rat that jumped over. It was the softest part of the bone biter rat, and the dagger directly stabbed into it. Dean hurriedly looked back and suddenly saw that in addition to the bone biter rat that was stabbed to death by Macon, 3 bone biter rats rushed out from the broken glass door of the supermarket. Their blood-red eyes stared at them. Like agile cheetahs, they quickly jumped from left to right and rushed toward Macon and Dean. Dean's face was ugly. He grabbed the dagger and retreated again and again. The dagger in his hand kept gently waving to intimidate these things. However, the simple intimidation did not scare these bone biter rats. One of them jumped in front of Dean and jumped over. Dean hurriedly slashed the dagger. The blade cut the bone biter rat's hair, but it was removed by the greasy and tough hair. The blade slipped and stuck to the bone biter rat's body. It was like using a sword to slap it, and it did not cause any damage at all. The next moment, the bone-biter rat fell on Dean's chest. The two sharp claws in front of it waved and scratched Dean's face. It was like the hunting instinct of a beast, knowing to attack the opponent's vital parts. Dean hurriedly grabbed its hair. Chapter 48. A panic scream came. Dean was shocked and quickly looked back. He saw Mason was surrounded by two bone rats and fell to the ground. Zach and Sham didn't watch the show. They stepped forward and punched and kicked the two bone rats. They didn't dare to attack with their daggers for fear of accidentally hurting Mason. Dean's face changed. He quickly pulled out his dagger and rushed over. "Fuck off!" Dean roared and kicked one of the bone-biter rats in the head with his metal boots. With a bang, the bone-biter rat's body fell backward. Zach saw the opportunity and quickly rushed forward, pressing the mouse on top of his body, raised his fist, and fiercely pounded its head. Sham grabbed the tail of the other bone rat and didn't let it climb to Mason's face. Dean had already grasped the experience of dealing with it. He bent down and pulled up the hind leg of the bone-biter mouse. He pulled it up directly, swung it hard, and smashed it on the ground. Its sharp little head hit the ground, and the strength of its struggle suddenly weakened. Dean roared and smashed it again and again. He repeatedly smashed it so that the bone rat couldn't find a point to break free from his palm. After a dozen consecutive smashes, the bone rat gradually stopped moving. Its body twitched reflexively. Blood oozed from its hair and stained the ground. At this time, Mason climbed up from the ground and cooperated with Zach to stab the other bone rat to death. Dean looked at the motionless bone rat in his hand. He grabbed his dagger and stabbed it a few times. He was relieved and sat on the ground. He felt that his arm was sore as if it was broken. His whole body was exhausted. He was so tired that he kept gasping for breath. The air filter by the mask was very slow. It made him feel suffocated and dizzy. Mason also sat next to him. He leaned back on Dean's back and gasped for breath. Zach and Sham were in a better state. They still had a lot of physical strength. But looking at the bodies of the bone rats on the ground, they were still frightened and pale. After resting for a while, Mason patted the hair caught between the gaps of his gloves. He gasped. It was damn dangerous. It almost cut my throat. These damn things. Dean's breathing gradually became smooth. He looked back at him and said, "This time, thanks to you." Mason snapped. "What are you talking about?" Dean smiled and no longer said anything. Zach said with lingering fear, "There are so many bone rats here. Didn't the hunters see them? Is it called cleaning?" Sham said, "Fortunately, our soft armor was tough and didn't get torn. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable." Dean looked at the rat corpse in front of his feet and recalled his previous battle. His fingers couldn't help but clench his fists. Too bad. His performance was too bad. If Macon hadn't shouted in time, he would have been attacked by the rat from behind. "You've already done very well. After all, this is the first time you've encountered a battle like this." Even an adult would panic when they see an ordinary dog pouncing at them. While he was blaming himself, another voice in his heart was comforting him. But soon, Dean strangled this weak voice. He tightly bit his lips. The pain invaded his mind. He wanted to let his weakness remember that he only had one life. In the face of death, excellence and failure were meaningless. The only thing that could save him was the strength to live. He suddenly understood why the scavengers would only choose from the residential area and the slums, and not from the commercial area's colleges. Because the mortality rate of this job was too high, although they encountered danger this time, mainly because they came to the 8th area that had just been cleaned. If they went to the 9th area that had been scavenged 10 times, the probability of encountering these monsters would be very low. However, the low probability of danger also meant that the harvest of scavenging was low. This was a dangerous and valuable profession. This was very fair. After the previous battle experience, Dean's heart still had some fear of death. This time they encountered a rat. Would they encounter a more terrible monster next time? Should he follow the group and obediently go back after the mission is over? He looked at the broken glass door of the supermarket. His heart was filled with retreat. But soon, he thought of his right arm and the scar on it. His eyes suddenly became firm. He climbed up with his palm on the ground and said to Mason and the other two, "Go in." There was such a big movement just now. The few inside should have come out, but maybe there is still some hiding in the dark. Everyone be careful. Mason, Zach, and Sham didn't expect Dean to dare to enter the ruins. They were a little surprised. When they saw his determined eyes, they hesitated for a moment and stood up. They clenched their daggers and were ready to resist the attack. At this time, suddenly, a shrill scream came from the nearby streets. It was especially loud in the decaying ruins. Dean and the other three were surprised. They suddenly thought of the rats that they had just encountered. Hearing this shrill scream, there was no doubt that the other side had encountered something. For a time, they hesitated. They didn't know whether they should go to help or not. Dean was aware of the hesitation in his heart. He thought for a moment and said, "Go and have a look. Be careful. If there is a situation, immediately withdraw." Mason and the other two were hesitant. When they heard his words, they immediately nodded. It was as if a stone fell from their hearts. They ran toward the direction of the scream. At this time, they saw other scavengers also rushed out of other buildings and ran toward the place where the scream came from. Soon, the scream was getting closer and closer. It was a street corner. Dean immediately slowed down and made a slight gesture. Mason, Zach, and Sham immediately understood. They slowed down their pace and slowly followed behind Dean. Around the corner, Dean looked out. His pupils shrank, and his face was full of horror. He saw the center of the green vegetated street. In front of a broken shop, two figures were twisting on the ground. One was a man, and the other was a woman. However, the figure's clothes were tattered, revealing gray and thin skin. Her hair was disheveled, and her fingers had turned into sharp claws. It was an undead, a living undead. At this moment, the female undead was lying on the struggling young man's body. She was gnawing the flesh on his chest. With Dean's vision, he could see it very clearly. He could even see the blood vessels that were constantly gushing out from the young man's chest. The young man's mouth and neck were dyed red. At the young man's feet, there was a black figure. It was a woman. Her body was motionless and seemed to be dead. Chapter 49. Aaron, save me. At this time, the young man who was bitten was lying on the ground. He raised his head and raised his hand to grab the frightened young man behind him. His face was full of fear and pain, as well as the desire for life. The young man called Aaron covered his mouth and looked at his friend. Tears flowed down his face. His body trembled slightly. He clenched his teeth and turned back. He strode toward the exit of the street. Dean immediately saw that the undead that was biting the young man seemed to be alarmed by his footsteps. It raised its head. Its disheveled face was full of ferociousness. It suddenly abandoned the food under its body and chased after Aaron. Its running posture was extremely twisted. Its arms were waving wildly, and its body was swaying unsteadily like a drunkard who could fall at any time. However, its speed was extremely fast. In its swaying pace, it seemed to have found a strange inertia and quickly caught up with Alan. Aaron heard the movement behind him. He looked back in horror. He suddenly saw the sharp claws of the undead slanting down like a few sharp daggers. He was scared and hurriedly raised his dagger to block. Although he was able to parry the claws of the undead, he was hit by the heavy force and fell to the ground. Seeing this scene, Dean was shocked. At the same time, there was a bit of panic in his heart. If he encountered such an undead monster alone, with his current physique, he would definitely die. At the moment, there was a bit of a feeling of relief in his heart. Fortunately, he did not choose this street. Otherwise, he and Mason would be the ones to end up like this. Seeing that the young man was gradually unable to resist, Dean suddenly had the intention to retreat. The previous idea of saving people had already been thrown to the back of his mind. Although these consortium scavengers were not formal graduates, but they had participated in many scavenging activities. The number of blessings they got was far more than them. Their strength was also several times stronger than them. At the moment, they were also unable to deal with the undead. Dean turned back and waved his hand, motioning them to leave. Mason and others were standing in the back. Although they didn't see the scene inside, they heard the screams and chewing sounds. After all, the ruins were too quiet, and the sound transmission was particularly clear. At this moment, seeing Dean's gesture, their faces suddenly changed. Recalling the previous encounter with the rats, they quickly and slowly retreated. At this time, from the other side of the street, there were 4 consortium scavengers who heard the sound and strode over. They were startled when they saw Dean and the others on the other side of the street. Suddenly, they heard screams coming from the corner. The handsome youth's face changed as he rushed out and saw a horrifying scene. The youth called Alan was bitten on the arm by the undead woman. His black soft armor didn't resist the latter's sharp teeth. Blood oozed out from the bite and slid down the black armor. Undead, the handsome young man's pupils constricted. He was a little shocked, but he did not retreat. He shouted, "Hold on." Then he turned to his 3 companions and said, "Let's go together and pin it down. Wait for the others and Scott to come." The 3 companions were also horrified, but they didn't hesitate. They held their daggers and rushed toward the undead, led by the handsome young man. When the undead woman heard the sound, she looked up at them. Her blood-stained gray face revealed a ferocious expression. She roared and stood up in the same weird, twisted posture as before. She waved her arms irregularly and rushed towards the handsome youth and the others. The handsome young man roared. He jumped up and kicked the undead's chest. Bang! He kicked the undead's chest. She flew backward and fell to the ground. Dean didn't rush to leave when he saw the 4 of them. He went back to the corner to continue to observe. When he saw the handsome young man kick the undead, he couldn't help but be happy. However, he didn't rush to help. The undead's agility made him feel a lingering fear. Mason and the other 2 people saw someone coming to fight. They went behind Dean and looked. They were shocked. When the handsome young man kicked the undead, the other 3 people immediately came forward to drag Alan on the ground. They pulled him back and left the battlefield. At this time, the undead's body quickly climbed up. She roared hoarsely and rushed toward the handsome young man. The handsome young man was aghast. He hurriedly swung his dagger. Puff! The dagger cut into the undead woman's arm and cut into the gray skin. However, there was no blood flowing out of the skin. From the cut surface, it seemed that there was black and red flesh inside, as if the blood had solidified. This caused the undead woman's body to be extremely hard. When the dagger cut halfway, it seemed to be stuck in the bones inside. The handsome young man's pupils shrank. He held the hilt and pulled hard, but he couldn't pull it out for a while. At this time, the undead woman took advantage of this short moment to pounce on his body. She raised her other arm and clawed at his throat. With a puff sound, the claw suddenly pierced the artery on the side of his neck. Blood gushed out and splashed on the arm of the undead woman. Vickers! The 3 people who dragged Alan from behind ran to help. They saw this scene and cried out. The handsome young man clutched his pierced neck and widened his eyes. It seemed that he did not expect his young life to end here. He raised his head with difficulty and looked at the horrifying face in front of him. His eyes gradually dimmed. The undead growled and grabbed his body. She bit his other neck and gnawed on his body. Monster! One of the stout companions roared in grief and indignation. He held the dagger and rushed toward the undead. The undead pushed the handsome young man's body away when she heard the voice. She swayed her body and rushed toward the stout young man. "Please, no, don't go." The 2 companions behind hurriedly shouted, but the pudgy youth's eyes had already turned red. He rushed up and stabbed with his dagger. Puff! The dagger pierced through the chest of the undead woman, who had no intention of dodging. He was startled for a moment. It seemed that he didn't expect to be killed so easily, but there was no joy in his heart. Instead, he was more sad. At this moment, the claws of the undead suddenly tore. One of the sharp claws of the index finger penetrated the cheeks of the stout, middle-aged man. The tip of the claw pierced through the other cheek of the stout, middle-aged man. The severe pain made the stout young man want to call out, but he was too frightened to call out. The next moment, he saw the hideous face approaching him and then biting his face. "Peas!" One of the companions cried out in grief. The other one pulled him and hurriedly retreated. He hoped to take advantage of the time when the stout young man was eaten to escape as far as possible. Dean's face also changed color. He didn't expect that the 4 consortia scavengers couldn't fight against the undead. The most terrible thing was that the dagger had pierced her chest, but it didn't affect her at all. Was she really an immortal monster? Suddenly, he thought of the undead woman who had died in the bathroom and the other corpses on the road. Along the way, he didn't just look for supplies. Instead, he paid more attention to these corpses. He suddenly thought that these corpses had one thing in common. That was, there were scars on their heads. Sword wounds or arrow wounds. Obviously, they were left by hunters. Chapter 50. As Dean was thinking, a lot of footsteps came from behind. He looked back and saw Scott and Mia with a large number of scavengers. Scott and Mia were running in front of the others. Their speed was extremely amazing. They were like human-shaped cheetahs. In the blink of an eye, they crossed hundreds of meters and arrived in front of Dean. "What's going on?" Scott asked in a hurry. Dean saw them appear. His tense heart loosened. Undead. He pointed to the corner of the street. Scott and Mia's expression changed. When they turned their heads to look, they saw the 2 scavengers dragging the unconscious Alan out of the street. They also saw Scott. Their sad faces were full of surprise. "Help! There's an undead. Save Peas." Scott and Mia hurriedly ran over and immediately saw the scene of the undead woman gnawing the chunky young man. Their faces changed. Scott immediately pulled out his dagger and said, "Prepare to fight and kill it together. Otherwise, it will keep following the smell we left behind." At this time, Mia saw the unconscious Alan. Her pretty face turned pale. She trembled. "What's his injury?" One of them said, "He was bitten by the undead. We rushed over and saw him resisting." Scott's face changed as he heard this. He gritted his teeth. "Kill him before he's infected. Otherwise, we will have to face 2 undead." The 2 scavengers' faces turned ugly. They were not rookies who were scavengers. They already knew that if they were bitten by the monsters outside the giant wall, they would be infected. However, knowing was one thing, but to kill a scavenging companion with his own hands, a living person, it was really hard for him to harden his heart. "Can't we save him?" One of the tall scavengers looked at Scott. "Maybe he can hold on." "Stupid." Scott interrupted him. His face was full of anger. "If you want to die, then leave with him or kill him immediately." At this time, the other youth trembled. "The undead is coming." Scott quickly focused his attention and stared at the undead woman. He saw that she had abandoned the prey in her hands, and her green eyes fell on them. She shook her body and attacked them at an incredible speed. So fast, Scott was shocked, but he did not retreat. He gritted his teeth and charged forward. With a bang, Scott took the lead and kicked the undead woman's abdomen. The latter didn't dodge and was immediately kicked to the ground. Scott seized the opportunity and quickly approached it. Seeing that it was getting up from the ground, he immediately kicked it in the face. The tip of the steel boot hit its chin, kicking it over again. "Die!" Scott growled and raised his dagger to stab the undead woman's face. Puff! The dagger pierced through the center of the undead woman's face. The undead woman's throat issued a dry roar. Her body twitched violently. She kept twisting and struggling on the ground, but her head was nailed to the ground by Scott. After struggling for a while, she gradually stopped moving. Seeing this, Scott was relieved. He slowly pulled out the dagger from the bones of the undead's cheeks. He held the dagger tightly. When he pulled it out, the undead's head was lifted off the ground. It was as if the undead had come back to life. The 2 youths watching from behind were startled. Duddian saw this scene and immediately knew that his guess was right. At this time, other scavengers also rushed over. They saw several bloody corpses on the scene. Their faces became very ugly. At this time, Scott turned around and looked at the 2 youths. He couldn't help but angrily said, "Do you want to die? If he wakes up, the first thing he will do is to bite you." After he finished speaking, he walked up to the 2 of them with his bloody sword. He lowered his head and looked at Alan, who was being held by them. He took a deep breath clenched his teeth, and stabbed his sword through Alan's throat. He twisted the sword and cut off Alan's head. Blood gushed out like a fountain. The two youths' faces were pale. Their legs were weak. They kept retreating. Scott coldly looked at them. He shook the blood off his dagger and said in a cold voice, "This is the law of survival outside the giant wall. You won't be able to learn it from the instructor. Either you adapt or you die." As he spoke, he glanced at Mia, who was standing at the side with her head lowered. He sighed and turned to the other scavengers. "Light a fire and burn the bodies here. Don't let the smell of blood attract other monsters that haven't been cleaned up." Many of these scavengers were newcomers. At the moment they saw such a cruel picture, their faces turned pale and they kept retreating. One of the short children said in horror, I want to go home. I don't want to scavenge anymore. I don't want money." Then he turned around and ran away. Scott angrily said, "Get him back from me." Two consortium scavengers immediately chased after him. At this time, one of the scavengers suddenly raised his trembling hand and pointed to the back of Scott. "Boss, they stood up?" Everyone was surprised and hurried to look. Dudian immediately saw that in the shop in the distance, the young man who was bitten first and the other female scavenger next to him were struggling to sit upright. At the same time, their heads looked up at the sky as if their cervical vertebrae were fractured. Then, under everyone's gaze, their heads slowly twisted stiffly, as if the tissues inside were rapidly adapting. "Damn!" Scott's face was ugly. He growled, "Everyone get ready to go with me." He took the lead and rushed forward. Mia gritted her teeth and took the lead to keep up. The other consortium scavengers hesitated for a moment, but quickly caught up with them. As for the newcomers who were in the same group as Dean, they stared blankly at the scene. Some of them fell to the ground as their legs went soft. Dudian had seen Scott's skills. He estimated that Scott and Mia should be able to deal with the two transformed undeads. He immediately clenched his dagger and followed. Mason, Zach, and Sham saw Dudian rush out and quickly pulled him. "Are you crazy?" Dudian quickly said, "I'm going to destroy the other two corpses so that they won't be transformed into undeads." The three immediately said, "I'll go too." The four of them ran behind the consortium scavengers and came to the corpses. The two corpses belonged to the handsome youth and the chunky youth. Dudian looked at the corpses in front of his feet. He hesitated for a moment, but clenched his teeth and used his dagger to cut their necks. After all, he had been enhanced twice. His strength was twice that of an ordinary adult. His sharp, short sword cut through their vertebrae in an instant. Dean's heart was pounding wildly. Although he knew that they were dead, he still had a sense of guilt and fear when he slashed at them. His hand, holding the dagger, trembled slightly, and he kept comforting himself in his heart. At this moment, he suddenly heard a scream of horror coming from the front. He hurriedly looked back. The dozen consortium scavengers in front, including Scott and Mia, were all horrified. They turned around and fled in their direction. Chapter 51. This so many. Dean and Mason couldn't help but be scared. At this time, Scott, who was running in the front, saw that they were still in a daze and suddenly roared, "Run!" Dean woke up and hurriedly turned around and ran. Mason, Zach, and Shaw quickly followed him. They ran like crazy. They wished they could grow 2 more legs. However, the gap between their physique and figure was finally reflected at this moment. Scott and Mia quickly passed them and ran towards the left side of the corner. They soon disappeared from the sight of Dean and the others. At this time, the other consortium scavengers also caught up. Get out of here!" A burly youth roared at Dean and others. He pushed Sham, who was the last one to fall. Puff! Sham was pushed to the side, and because of his fall, he tripped several youths who were rushing over. For a time, 4 or 5 people fell to the ground, and everyone was desperately trying to climb up. Dean heard Sham's screams and quickly stopped. He looked back and saw Sham's cheeks were bruised and fell to the ground. He had just climbed up, but another youth used his hand to press his head down. The youth stood up and quickly ran away. Hundreds of meters behind them, more than a dozen undeads were chasing them. Dean's face was pale, his fists were tightly clenched, and his heart was beating so fast that it was deafening. He fiercely clenched his teeth and ran back to the front of Sham. He grabbed his arm and shouted, "Get up!" Sham hurriedly grabbed him. Dean immediately turned and continued to run. At this time, the other consortium scavengers had already run in front of them. They followed the direction of Scott and Mia and disappeared around the corner. Sham looked back and saw more than a dozen bloodthirsty undeads behind him. His scalp tingled, his legs trembled, and he almost tripped again. At this time, Mason and Zach also turned and rushed over. They hurriedly grabbed Sham's body and dragged him forward. "Go to the right side." Soon, several people came to the corner. Dean gritted his teeth and said. Mason and the other two were startled, but there was no time to ask. They could only follow Dean and run to the right. At this time, Dean bit his palm and blood oozed out. He took a deep breath and grabbed a gravel from the ground. He spat the blood from his mouth and turned towards the direction where Scott, Mia, and the others had left. He threw the gravel towards the direction where Scott, Mia, and the others had left. Dong dong. The stone fell to the ground in a parabola and rolled a few times. At this time, they were already more than 30 meters away from the corner. The undead chasing them just came to the direction of the corner. As soon as they stepped out, they saw the stone flying in front of them. The next moment, the undead roared and chased in the direction of the stone. The few walking corpses behind it immediately followed it and chased after it. However, there was an undead among them. It seemed to be aware of Dean and the others on the right side and chased after them. Dean's face changed. He hurriedly glanced at both sides of the street. He suddenly saw more than 10 meters in front of him. There was a gate of a community. There was a small shop covered with vegetation in front of the door. He immediately said, "Come with me." He ran to the community. As soon as he ran over, he saw a few corpses lying on the ground. The security room in front of the door had long been corroded by moss. From a few exposed glass windows, he could vaguely see a humanoid shadow standing inside. Dean didn't dare to look again. He quickly stepped over the corpses on the ground and rushed to the nearest building. The security door under the building was not locked. It was slightly open. There was a corpse on the doorstep. Judging from the clothes, it was also an undead. Dean resisted the trembling in his heart. He stepped on the back of the undead and entered the back door. He looked back and said to Mason and the other two, "Come in." The three of them saw the corpse at the door. Their faces were a little pale, but they still resisted the fear and jumped over it. At this time, Dean saw that the previous undead had caught up with them, and behind it, there were two more undead. Dean's face changed. He hurriedly grabbed the door and wanted to lock it, but he found that the bolt had long been covered with moss. He immediately gave up trying to lock it. Looking back, the building was dark. There was an elevator in front of him. At the moment, the elevator door was half open. It was also covered with moss and vegetation. There were several corpses lying inside. Some were undead, and some were decayed human skeletons. The bones were dark, like rusty black iron. Dean's face was ugly. He immediately ran down the stairs and said, "Keep up." Mason and the other two quickly followed him. When Dean entered the building, he looked at the height of the building. It was at least 15 floors. He went straight up the stairs. Along the way, he saw 7 or 8 corpses, rotten human skeletons, and dog skeletons. When he ran to the 6th floor, Dean was tired and out of breath. The same was true of Mason and the other two. In fact, the previous battle with the rats had almost exhausted their physical strength. At this moment, they were completely frightened and ran away, breaking their physical limit. Roar, roar. At this time, a hoarse roar came from the bottom of the floor. The sound was approaching rapidly. Dean looked down along the staircase handrail. He suddenly saw several gray palms grabbing the handrail and climbing along the stairs. However, the climbing speed was obviously blocked. Nevertheless, seeing that they were still approaching, Dean's face became more and more ugly. He gritted his teeth and continued to climb up. Soon, Dean came to the 12th floor. He was tired and panting. He heard the unconscious roar of the undead. It was more than 10 meters below. He estimated that they should be about 3 floors away from him. He was about to continue to go up. Suddenly, Sham pointed to an open room next to him. He gasped, "Dean, we should hide in here. They should not open the door." Dean was startled. He immediately reacted and said, "Go in." He took the lead and went in. Mason and the other two immediately followed. Dean locked the door. Because of the high floor, the moss and vegetation didn't climb up, so the latch was easy to lock. Dean twisted the latch and locked it. Then he quickly glanced back at the house. He saw that the living room was very messy. There was a rotten corpse lying on the ground. There was a stroller next to it. There was a baby's corpse inside. Dean immediately said, "Move the sofa inside and block the door. Be gentle." Sofa? Macon and the others didn't understand, but when they saw the direction of Dean's finger, they understood what he was talking about. They immediately ran over. The three of them lifted the sofa and quickly moved it to the door. They gently put it down and put it against the door. At this time, the roar outside the door was getting clearer. Dean hurriedly made a silent gesture. He stood on the sofa and looked out through the peephole. The peephole was extremely cloudy. Dean immediately saw a few blurred figures appear from outside the door. It was the previous undead. The three undead seemed to climb the stairs out of inertia. They continued to climb up the stairs. Dean was relieved, but his heart was still pounding. He was only one door away from the bloodthirsty monster, but he felt that the world seemed to be still and only his strong heartbeat echoed in his ears. Roar. Chapter 52. Dean was scared and hurriedly pressed against the door. The door lock was old and rusty. It fell off from the door frame under the first punch of the undead. Fortunately, there was a sofa cushioning it, so it wasn't directly pushed open. Mason and the other two were scared and rushed to push the sofa. The result was that the sofa cracked from the middle. The wooden frame of the sofa had long been rotten. It couldn't withstand the gravity and suddenly turned into debris. At the same time, with a bang, the door was broken, and a gray and pale palm stretched in, grabbing randomly. Fortunately, it was an adult undead, and it was much taller than Dean, so it didn't catch Dean behind the door. Dean was pale. He forgot that the building had been corroded for 300 years and had long been dilapidated. He clenched his teeth and said to Mason and the other two, "Jump from the window and go to the next floor." Mason and the other two were panicking. But after all, they had undergone 3 years of training. They quickly responded. Mason said, "I'll help you. You go first." "Go," Dean roared. The three slightly gritted their teeth and no longer said anything. They came to the side of the window and looked down. The height of 12 floors made them feel dizzy, but at the moment there was no retreat. Sham was the most meticulous. He glanced at the object mounted on the wall outside the balcony. He said, "We should be able to grab the balcony of the next floor if we step on it." It was an air conditioner box. Mason was the most courageous among the three. He looked at it. Although he was worried about its firmness, he clenched his teeth and took the lead to jump. Bang! The air conditioner couldn't bear his weight and suddenly collapsed. Macon was so scared that his heart stopped beating, but he was prepared for it. He hurriedly stepped on the falling air conditioner and used it to grab the balcony of the lower floor. The falling air conditioner fell vertically. After smashing several air conditioners in a row, it fell straight into the grass at the edge of the community. It made a loud noise. Mason clenched his teeth and climbed to the balcony. He looked back at Sham and Zach. They had no leverage, so they could only jump straight down. Mason shouted, "I will catch you. Sham, you jump first." Sham was the thinnest and lightest of the three. He hesitated for a moment as he looked at the open arms of Macon. He jumped down. Mason quickly grabbed Sham's body, but the inertia of the fall almost took him off the balcony. He felt a tearing pain in his arm, but he still tightly grabbed Sham, gritted his teeth, and pulled him to the balcony. Sham was still in a state of shock. He almost thought that he would die. He looked at Macon's painful face. His heart was filled with gratitude and guilt. At this time, Zach hurriedly said, "Are you ready? I'm going to jump." Mason shook his arm and said to Sham, "Let's catch him together." Sham nodded. Both of them opened their arms and said to Zach, "Jump." Zach slightly gritted his teeth and jumped down. Macon and Sham spread out their hands and immediately caught Zach. Macon's arm was in pain. He almost slipped and let go of Zach. He was scared and pale. When the three of them jumped to the balcony, Dean couldn't resist the push of the three undeads outside. The door that was once strong, but now as fragile as paper, was smashed by the three undeads. He abandoned the door. He knew that Macon and the others went to the balcony of the room. He immediately turned to the other side of the kitchen. Along the way, he lifted the table and the TV on the table to the center of the living room, trying to slow down the speed of the undeads. Although the speed of the undeads was far faster than him, but their brains didn't seem to be very good. They didn't know how to avoid. They suddenly tripped over the TV and the table on the ground. At this time, Dean seized the opportunity to run to the kitchen. He threw the kitchen knives and plates on the table at the undeads. The damage caused was minimal, but he succeeded in attracting all of them. Dean hurried to the bathroom next to the kitchen. He closed the door without any defense. He looked at the ventilation window of the toilet. It was made of aluminum alloy, but the edges had long been rotten. After 300 years of baptism, even the walls of the whole building were peeling off layers of bubble-like soil. He didn't say anything. He stepped on the toilet and lifted his foot to kick it. Bang! The window was suddenly kicked open. The narrow window was just enough to accommodate his body. If he was an adult, it would be somewhat difficult. However, when he stretched his head and looked out of the window, the height of the 12-story building, the moss-covered cars on the street, like a small steamed bun, made him dizzy. However, the roar behind him was fast approaching. Even without looking back, Dean knew that the three undeads had climbed up and rushed over. He could only jump. He gritted his teeth and jumped. There was no air conditioner on the outside wall. After all, no one would install air conditioner outside the bathroom. There were 2 white pipes on the smooth porcelain wall. Most of them were the pipes used for toilet excretion. Dean had already noticed it. When he jumped, he grabbed the water pipe. Bang! The water pipe was like a piece of paper. It was immediately crushed by him. The water pipe below was also pulled down by him. Dean's face changed dramatically. He hurriedly inserted his backhand. With a loud thud, the short sword in his hand stabbed into the wall and stopped his falling body. Dean's heart fell a little. When he saw that the door and the sofa were vulnerable, he thought of the previous scavenging. He saw some sword marks left on the wall by the hunters. As a result, he bet right. The wall was no longer strong, and the sword could cut a huge gap. Roar! Roar! At this time, 2 ferocious heads popped out of the toilet window. 2 undeads were lying on the window, clawing at him. Above them, another undead rushed over. The body of the undead squeezed crazily. The wall next to the window was squeezed like mud. Looking at its crazy appearance, Dean, who had just saved his life, could not help but be shocked. His pupils suddenly shrank. He thought of a terrible possibility. He hurriedly looked down. It was only 1 meter away from the toilet window on the next floor. If there were 2 daggers at this time, he could easily use each other to climb to the next floor. But at this moment, there was only 1 dagger in his hand. Once it was pulled out, it would fall immediately. Dean gritted his teeth and looked at the windowsill more than 1 meter away from his feet. The windowsill was only half a palm wide. It was extremely difficult to jump and required great courage. However, looking at the body of the third undead that kept squeezing out, Dean did not dare to wait any longer. His body swayed slightly, and he suddenly jumped. With a whoosh, his body fell quickly, and the soles of his feet stepped on the windowsill of the toilet. However, because of the wall, the soles of his feet could not step firmly. His toes rubbed a little, and his body continued to jump down. This short distance made Dean feel as if his head had exploded and some blankness. The next moment, his palms suddenly stretched out, and at the moment of falling, he grabbed the windowsill. At that moment, it seemed that he was alive again. Dean looked at the undeads that had squeezed out more than half of their bodies. He hurriedly raised his other hand and smashed the window. Bang! The window was immediately smashed. The glass fragments pierced his fist, and blood dripped. He did not feel the pain for a while. His palm grasped the edge of the glass fragments and quickly climbed up and drilled through the window. Whoosh! Just as he drilled in, a gust of wind rolled up behind him. Dean hurriedly looked down and saw that the undeads finally squeezed out of the toilet window, fell straight down, and fell into the grass on the edge of the downstairs. At this time, because of the squeezing of the undeads, the space for the other two undeads suddenly increased. Dean immediately saw that one of the undeads was lying on the body of the other undeads, roaring and grabbing him. Dean was startled. Could it be that these undeads only knew how to attack and had no self-protection consciousness? Chapter 53. No consciousness. Dean's heart was pounding. These undeads are not the same as the rats. Although the rats are bloodthirsty, they have the consciousness of the beasts. They know how to hide, sneak attack, evade, and escape. But these undeads are different. They will only instinctively pounce on the prey. Their attack posture is completely based on instinct. There is no sense of evasion or sneak attack. It's like a killing machine, and it's an incomplete machine. Once the prey is locked, there is no other skill except for the attack command. Dean's blood was faintly boiling. He felt that he had grasped a crucial information that could keep him alive. They will only attack crazily. This is the most terrible thing about the undeads, but it's also their fatal weakness. At this time, on the other balcony, Mason, Zach, and Sham heard the sound of the window breaking. They rushed over and saw Dean standing in the toilet. They were somewhat surprised. "You? How did you come in from here?" "Roar, roar." At this time, a hoarse roar came from outside the window and fell into their ears. Hearing this sound, Mason and the other two were shocked. They suddenly realized that the undeads were in the toilet above their heads. Obviously, Dean deliberately attracted them there. The reason for doing so was obviously to give the three of them time to escape. But he took the risk of jumping from the window without a foothold. These thoughts flashed in their minds for a moment. The eyes of the three suddenly turned red. What is friendship? In the most dangerous moment, they are still thinking about how to save you, even if they don't consider whether they can live or not. Although in the past 3 years of training, Dean had helped them many times. They also occasionally helped Dean. The four of them supported each other, but that was the assessment. If they failed, at most they would have to pack up and go home. But in front of them, there was a bloody, cruel, real death. Standing in front of death, they still did this. The three of them felt that their souls were trembling. They were grateful, moved, and angry because they hated themselves for being weak. Dean did not notice the emotional changes of the three people. He slightly nodded to them to show that he was safe. He looked back at the window and saw that the two undeads were still desperately struggling to squeeze out of the window. But because they could not see him, the struggle was not as fierce as before. Dean was worried that they would retreat again, so he went around the stairs. He immediately stretched out his arm and shook it gently outside the window, as if to say, "Come on, come on." The two walking dead saw the shaking arm, and their eyes suddenly turned violet. They roared and struggled madly. Bang! The walking dead suddenly broke free, and a large piece of soft concrete by the window fell down. Dean hurriedly retracted his arm to avoid being caught. Otherwise, he would have been dragged down. At this time, the last remaining undead occupied a large window and easily struggled out. It followed and fell straight down. Then there were two loud sounds, which were particularly clear in this quiet community. Dean breathed a sigh of relief and looked out of the window. He saw 3 undeads falling into the grass downstairs, stacked together. In vain, the undeads at the top twisted slightly and staggered to stand up again. Dean's face changed. He didn't expect that it wouldn't die from such a fall. He patted his head and forgot that this monster could only be killed by destroying its head. Falling from the height of 12 floors would only make its body a little more broken. At this time, he saw the undeads shaking their body and looked up at Dean. They opened their mouth and roared. Then they suddenly climbed to the wall. 2 sharp claws fiercely clasped the wall, as if climbing a rock. A $hashtag. Do you think you were Spider-Man? Dean almost vomited blood. Fortunately, he did not go upstairs but chose to go downstairs. Otherwise, he could not stop them. Mason and the other 2 came to the window and looked at the fast-climbing undeads. Their faces changed. Dean did not panic. After the previous process of jumping from the 12th floor to the 11th floor, he felt as if he had died once. Later, he was aware of the weakness of these undeads. In his heart, he was no longer afraid of these undeads. "Give me the sword," Dean said coldly. Mason immediately understood what he was going to do and quickly handed him the sword. Dean held the dagger and looked at the walking dead that was climbing fast against the wall. He looked at the gray, middle-aged face approaching, but his heart no longer trembled. Instead, he became calmer. When the walking dead was half a meter away from the window, he suddenly stabbed the dagger. Puff! The dagger accurately pierced through the walking dead's eye socket and directly penetrated the soft brain tissue. The undead's body trembled. Its body seemed to suddenly lose its strength and fell down. Bang! It hit the two undeads below. The two undeads did not move. They seemed to be dead. Dean glanced at them and found that because they were in a downward posture, their heads fell to the ground, causing their skulls to crack and die on the spot. The third undeads fell on their bodies and got a body cushion, so it did not directly fall to death. At the moment, the three undeads were all solved. Dean's heart was relieved. He felt a burst of soreness in his body. From the fight with the rats until now, the continuous, strenuous exercise had completely overdrawn his physical strength. He immediately sat on the toilet and looked at the three people in front of him. He gasped and smiled. "Are you hurt?" Mason shook his head and sighed. "There is no one to save us. When you're also in trouble, let us save you." Dean laughed. "Go to hell, don't curse me." After surviving a disaster, the tense nerves of several people relaxed. One by one, regardless of the dirty ground, sat on the ground to rest. "Do you think Scott and the others will be okay?" Zach said. Dean suddenly thought of his previous action of throwing stones to lead the group of undeads to them. He could not help but change his face. At that time, the situation was critical. He did not think that he would do such a thing. He thought about it carefully. Perhaps when he saw the consortium scavengers push down Sham, he was too angry and made such a move. Or perhaps the deepest part of his heart was evil. Dean shook his head slightly and no longer thought about it. He said, "Take a break and then go to find them." The faces of the three people changed. Sham suddenly said, "You say, how can there suddenly be so many undeads? Wasn't it cleaned by the hunters? Is this the so-called cleaning?" Dean slightly frowned. He also felt puzzled about this. If it was to leave the rats, he could understand. After all, in a head-on fight, the scavengers did not lose to the rats. Moreover, the rats were hiding in the sewers, so it was really difficult to kill. But these undeads were different. The strength and speed of the scavengers were not on the same level. Even if 10 people besieged one, they would suffer heavy losses, let alone leaving so many. They should have been ignored by the hunters, or they came from another area. Dean pondered. Mason and the other two people were startled and did not say anything. After a moment, Dean felt that he had enough rest. He patted the dust on his buttocks and stood up. Looking at the dagger on the wall outside the window, he was distressed. Without the dagger, it would be extremely dangerous to encounter any monsters. He thought about it and searched the room. As a result, he found that the quilts and clothes left here were all torn like pieces of paper. He suddenly saw vines crawling outside the wall. He immediately used Mason's dagger to cut off a string and twisted it into a rope. He threw it to the hilt of the dagger nailed to the wall. After several attempts, he finally pulled the dagger out from the wall. Dean was relieved when he took back the dagger. At this time, he heard Sham's panicked voice. "Dean, come here." Dean was surprised and hurried to the windowsill where Sham was lying. He immediately saw that on the street outside the community, there were more than a dozen undeads wandering over. They did not go along the street, but turned into the community. Chapter 54. They're looking for us. Sham looked at the swaying figures and said in a creepy tone, "Did they smell us?" "Impossible, we are so far away." Dean's eyes were gloomy as he stared at the wandering figures. "They shouldn't be aware of us. Otherwise, they wouldn't move so slowly." Scott has so many people, so the smell should be much stronger than ours. Unless there are more than a dozen undeads coming from there. Mason hurriedly looked at him. Dean, what should we do now? They're getting close to the building. If it goes on like this, they will be aware of us. Don't panic. Dean frowned as he recalled the previous events. He suddenly thought of a neglected issue. If these undeads don't have the awareness to avoid us, then they can do stupid things like jumping off a building. It shows that they don't have the concept of death. They don't realize what danger is. In that case, how can they catch prey? Scott said that they will track the smell of blood. But if that's the case, then the smell of blood from the corpses that were bitten by the undead is enough to attract all of them. Even if the corpses have been eaten, they will leave traces of blood on their mouths and hands. If other undeads are really bloodthirsty and crazy for blood, then they will inevitably bite the claws and mouth of their companions. But in fact, those undead saw us and chased us. They completely ignored the corpses on the ground. This can only show that although blood will attract them, but there is something more than blood that makes them crazier and crazier. Dean's eyes flashed with a dark luster as if he could see through everything. Previously, the undead woman heard Alan's voice and abandoned the corpses to chase after us. I used stones to lure them away. It is likely that the thing that really attracted them was not the blood on the stones, but the sound? Dean was not happy after speculating this conclusion, but slightly frowned. He always felt that he had overlooked a very important piece of information. He continued to flip through the memories in his mind. The scenes after he came to area number 8 flashed by quickly. He saw countless corpses that had been hunted and killed. Suddenly, he was shocked. No, it was not a sound. In other words, sound was the same as blood. Although it could attract their attention, it was not what they desired the most, nor was it the main method they relied on to track their prey. The real reason was Dean and the others. That was heat. Yes, this was the main way that Dean thought of. Their main way of catching prey was to sense the heat of the prey. In short, they had thermal vision. However, it could not be called vision because some undead's eyes were pierced and some eyes were protruding. Dean guessed that their brains may have mutated into a mysterious organization that could automatically perceive the surrounding heat. Any warm-blooded animal would appear in their sensory network. Although he wasn't completely sure about this speculation, but he felt that it was the most likely one based on the current information. He looked at the undeads that were gradually approaching downstairs. Suddenly, he had an idea. He looked at Macon and the other two. Macon, you find something hard and throw it to other places. See if you can use sound to distract them. Zach, you immediately ignite a torch. The three of them were surprised, but their eyes lit up. Although they didn't know the purpose of making a torch, but using sound to distract the undeads was a good idea. Let me do it. Macon immediately ran to the room to search. He broke off a few mud-like bricks from the bedroom wall. He went to the previous kitchen and threw them toward the building. Bang! The bricks fell to the ground and turned into powder. The sound spread in the quiet neighborhood. The shaking undeads were immediately attracted to the sound. Macon was excited to see the method working. He continued to throw the torch. Moreover, he threw farther and farther away so that the undeads would be far away. Dean was relieved to see that the sound was effective. He saw that Zach was also using the fire scythe to ignite the clothes in the room to make a torch. He immediately said, "Throw the torch and see." Zach froze for a moment. He couldn't figure out what Dean was thinking, but he still listened to him and threw the torch. The flame rolled in the air and fell to the ground, almost extinguished. Duddian immediately looked closely. He saw the sound of the torch falling on the ground. Several undeads who were running behind turned back. But Macon threw the brick again, causing a huge sound. The undeads were attracted to the direction of the brick. Soon they left the community and came to the street where the brick fell. Dean suddenly felt strange. Did he guess wrong? He frowned and looked at the undeads who were attracted by the sound. He thought that it was wrong. Anyway, it was good to lead the undeads away. At this time, the distance of the stones thrown by Macon had reached the limit. The undeads wandered around the place where the stones fell. They wandered for a moment and suddenly staggered toward the neighborhood. Dean and the other three were relieved, but they suddenly widened their eyes and almost cursed out loud. What's the situation? Dean was a little surprised. They had been led away, so why were they still so persistent in drilling into this community? And looking at the direction of the undeads, they were still in this building. The only difference between this building and the other buildings was that there were 4 of them. How could this be? Sham was stunned. Sham hurriedly said, "Hurry up and continue to throw." Macon reacted and hurriedly ran to the wall to buckle the bricks and continue to throw. Soon, the wandering undeads were attracted. They were a little relieved, but their hearts were not happy. Using the sound to lure the undeads was not a long-term solution. Moreover, the time was long. Maybe the undeads from other places would be attracted. Dean frowned. What was it about them that attracted the undeads? Wait, if it is the heat, can they distinguish the difference between the heat in the body and the flame? Dean suddenly thought of this. His face slightly changed. If this was the case, there was no other way but to reduce the heat in their body. However, to reduce the heat, they could only take off their clothes. However, the nuclear radiation in the air was strong. If they took off their clothes, the radiation value would increase rapidly. Dean bowed his head in contemplation. Mason and the other 2 took turns to throw the bricks. Whenever the undead was ready to return to the community, they would throw a brick. The rhythm was very stable, and there was no random throwing. After a long while, Dean made a decision. He looked at Mason and the other 2. Who is willing to go down with me and bring up an undead? Hearing this, Mason and the other 2 were shocked. Bring the undead up? Dead or alive? What are you doing? The 3 that just died. Dean seriously said, I want to dissect them. The fastest way to understand something was to see it thoroughly from the inside out. Although Dean had no medical experience and did not know much about the human body, but in such a harsh environment, there were limited ways to try. This was the only way he could think of to understand the undead as soon as possible. Chapter 55. If you want to dissect, isn't there one here? Sham pointed to the living room. There was an old undead lying there. It should be the owner of the house. Dean shook his head slightly. I want to dissect the recently dead ones. I want to speculate from their behavior. As for the ones that have been killed by hunters, I will dissect them to see what changes will happen to their bodies after they die. I'll go with you. Zach gritted his teeth. Dean nodded slightly and immediately equipped his dagger. He pushed open the door and went down the corridor with Zach. One of the corridors collapsed, but it wasn't difficult for the 2 of them. They could directly jump over the first floor of the corridor. Soon, the 2 came to the ground floor and looked outside. They saw the undead were led away by Mason and Sham. They immediately opened the door and ran to the side of the corner. They immediately saw 3 corpses piled up on the ground. Although their heads were broken, there was no blood flowing out. Dean grabbed the undead that he had stabbed to death. He whispered to Zach to help. Zach's face was pale. No one wanted to get close to this terrible, bloodthirsty monster. But he still resisted the fear in his heart and went forward to support the other arm of the undead. Dean was not worried about being infected with the virus and radiation of the undead. He carried it back to the building with Zach. The undead was heavier than Dean imagined. It looked like a skinny young man, but it felt like a fat man that weighed 200 or 300 pounds. Fortunately, he had been blessed twice. His strength was more than 3 times that of an adult. Otherwise, it would be extremely difficult to move the undead. Soon, the 2 of them moved the corpse to the floor where the stairs had collapsed, which was the 9th floor. Dean put down the undead and went to the room to check again. He didn't see any hidden rats or other dangers, so he moved the undead in. The original owner of the room had died, and the blood on the ground had long been covered with dust. There was the body of a teenage boy lying on the ground. Judging from the long nails, it was also an undead. Not far from the body of the boy, under the table, there was a corpse. The hair was very long. It was obviously a woman. The flesh and blood were rotten, and the corpse was also very dark due to the radiation. Dudian went to the bedroom and took out some moldy and rotten quilts. He covered the corpses on the ground to cover the pungent smell of corpses. Then he asked Zach to sweep away the scattered items in the living room to make an open space. At this time, Sham saw that the two didn't return for a long time, so he ran down. He was relieved to see them in the room, but soon he looked at the undead in front of Dean's feet. He trembled. Really want to dissect it? Dean nodded firmly. If it was before today, he would never dare to dissect a human body. But now, after seeing the bloody scene of the previous gnawing and seeing Scott and other desperate people running past him, he gradually understood that if he wanted to live, he could only rely on himself. No one could protect him, except for the sharp knife in his hand. Dean held the dagger and gently poked the claws of the undead. Suddenly, he saw that the surface of the dark and sharp claws was incomparably hard, as cold and hard as black iron. When the dagger stabbed the surface, it was like stabbing steel. This is the evolved tissue of a creature. Dean was secretly shocked. In addition to the claws, the undead souls were also growing like sharp claws. The pitch-black cuticle covered most of the souls, looking extremely hideous. Dean looked at the chest of the undead. There was still a trace of timidity in his heart. He took a deep breath, clenched his teeth, and stabbed. Puff! The dagger pierced into the belly of the undead, but no blood sputtered out. Dean was relieved. To be honest, if he saw the blood oozing out, he felt that he would vomit. After all, Scott also said that the so-called undead were infected humans. Dean slightly moved the dagger to the side. He saw the tissue of the incision. His face slightly changed. He saw that under the gray skin, there was brown flesh. The blood seemed to solidify in the flesh. To be precise, it seemed to be frozen inside. Frozen? Dean vaguely thought that the body of the undead was exceptionally cold. Not only did it not have the slightest temperature that a living creature should have, but it was cold like an ice cube. No wonder there was no sign of decay under such a freezing temperature. However, Dean saw that the other undead killed by the hunters had serious signs of decay, especially the female undead that died in the bathroom. Her face and body were completely rotten. Thinking of this, Dean could not help but look at the body of the boy in the room. He immediately went forward to check. Like the other dead undead, the boy's head was also destroyed. It was split from the middle into two. It should have been cut by a very tough and sharp sword. He could not see the original appearance. The boy's neck, arms, chest, and other parts showed signs of decay. The skin was swollen like blisters. Dean used the dagger to gently poke the rotten skin like tofu. The tip of the dagger easily penetrated it. Dark red blood oozed out. Dean smelled the strong corpse odor exuded from the body. His stomach was bursting with nausea. At the same time, he was at a loss. Why would these undead rot like humans after death and emit the same stench? Were these undead really alive? If they were alive, why there was no consciousness? Even the basic instincts that a living creature should have. Dean silently pondered, then got up and went back to the previous undead. He opened its eyelids. It had a Western face, but the eyes were green. There seemed to be countless fibers in the pupils. Did they rely on these eyes to track their prey? Dean was silent. He used the dagger to gently cut the end of the nose. Inch by inch, the raised nose was flattened, revealing two dark nostrils. Dean looked at it and slightly frowned. He turned its head sideways and cut off its ears. He dug a vortex with its ears as the center. This process made Zach and Sham pale. Their legs trembled. They were not afraid of the undead, but Dean's expression. It was a very focused, very serious expression. This kind of expression made them feel a heartfelt chill from the bottom of their hearts. They were more afraid than facing a living undead. Even after many years, they still could not forget this scene. At this time, Dean hollowed out the ears of the undead and immediately saw that the ears were full of thick dust. He felt strange in his heart. These undead had not dug out earwax for more than 300 years. Their ears had long been accumulated with layers of dust, just like stuffing ear cotton. Their hearing should be very weak. Why were they so sensitive to sound? Could it be that they had evolved a new organ to replace their sense of hearing? Dean pondered for a moment. He pushed the undead's chin and looked at its tongue. The tongue had long been broken. It seemed that it was stabbed when biting prey. It could be seen that the undead really did not know how to protect themselves. It also did not feel pain. Thinking of this, Dean was startled. He remembered that when Scott killed the undead, he used a dagger to nail the undead's head. The undead screamed, and its body kept twitching. Since it did not feel pain, why did it have such a reaction? His eyes flashed for a moment. Suddenly, he waved the dagger and cut the undead's mouth from both sides. His palms pressed down hard. Soon, the undead's entire jaw was abruptly cut off by him, but there was still no trace of blood. Dean immediately cut off its head. From the cut of the chin, he looked inside the head. Inside was the upper cavity and cold flesh. He slightly frowned. He was somewhat embarrassed, but he remembered that there were 2 spare ones downstairs. He immediately clenched his teeth and used the dagger to stab inside. He rotated and stirred. The flesh and brain cells inside were crushed. Then he knocked the head on the floor to knock out all the crushed tissues. Suddenly, a hard object rolled out from the head. It fell to the ground and hit the shoulder of the undead. It was a thumb-sized, perfectly round dark blue ball. Chapter 56. Dean, Sham, and Zach's eyes fell on the dark blue ball. They couldn't help but be startled. In the skull, a ball fell out. The ball was a natural, perfect circle, and the color was dark blue. Obviously, it was not a hard skull tissue, but a blue metal ball. But how could there be metal in the brain? Dean was surprised, but he didn't touch it with his hand. Instead, he used his dagger to poke the ball. The dagger tip immediately slipped, and the ball rolled down to the broken neck of the undead. So hard. Dean's eyes moved. The activity of hard objects was poor, and the speed of infection was slow. Moreover, it would not penetrate like a liquid. He had gloves to isolate it, so a simple touch should not be a big deal. He immediately reached out and picked it up. As soon as he grabbed the dark blue ball, Dean's whole body quivered. There was only one feeling in his fingers: cold. Extremely cold. It was like holding an ice ball. He couldn't help but think of the frozen blood in the corpse. Was it because of this dark blue ball? At this time, the cold seemed to spread, climbing along the dark blue ball to Dean's arm. He felt the temperature of his whole arm was dropping rapidly, and it was a little stiff. He could not help but put the dark blue ball in the other hand. Soon, the other hand also felt a little frozen. At the same time, Dean felt cold all over his body, as if he was in the black snow season, extremely cold. How can it be? Even if both hands are holding a piece of ice, it's only the hands that are frozen. How can my whole body feel cold? I feel the cold from the soles of my feet. Dean was surprised. It was like playing with a snowball in winter. At most, the hands were cold, but the body was warm. But at the moment, he felt cold all over, as if his whole body was stuck to a piece of ice. He immediately put the dark blue ball on the ground, rubbed his hands together, and breathed. He felt a little warm, but soon he felt hungry. He had not eaten anything since he came out of the giant wall. He suppressed his hunger and looked at the dark blue ball in puzzlement. Suddenly, he thought of a reason. Heat absorption. Dean woke up. This dark blue ball will absorb heat, just like saltpeter and black gunpowder. Saltpeter is not only one of the raw materials of black gunpowder, but also can make ice. In this world, most alchemists have mastered the use of saltpeter to make ice, but they haven't found that saltpeter mixed with sulfur can explode. Saltpeter to make ice was because it absorbed the heat in the water, so the water turned into ice. Just now, he felt his whole body was cold. Obviously, this dark blue ball had the same heat absorption function as saltpeter. If he held it in his hand, it would absorb heat along the arm until the body heat was absorbed. Then the body temperature would drop. When it dropped to a certain level, the heartbeat would stop and the body would freeze to death. No wonder the body temperature of these undead are so low. So cold. It turned. No wonder this undead body temperature is so low. So cold. It was because of this thing. But how can it appear in the undead's brain? Dean was full of curiosity. If someone was implanted into their brain, then naturally it was impossible. After all, there were so many undead. How would it take a lot of energy and time to implant one by one? If it's not artificial, then it's its own growth. However, although the undead are virus-infected humans, After all, they are flesh and blood. How can they grow such a hard metal object and have such strange characteristics? Dean felt strange. At this time, a figure suddenly jumped down from the stairs. It immediately alarmed the few people in the room. When they saw that it was Macon, they were relieved. Mason was relieved when he saw that all three of them were there. He said, "Scared me to death. I almost thought that something happened to you down there." Sham scratched his head. "I was watching Dean's dissection. I forgot to inform you." Zach reacted and hurriedly said, "You came down. What about the undead?" Mason rolled his eyes and said, "Of course, I came back. I'm tired. Who can replace me?" "I'll go." Sham looked at the head of the undead that was beheaded. He felt his stomach churning. Dean's thoughts were interrupted by Mason. He continued to think about it, but there was no clue. He could not help but sigh. He no longer continued to dwell on this aspect. The most important thing was to survive. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. He immediately said to Zach and Mason, "Come with me. Let's go downstairs." Both of them had some doubts, but still followed. Dean went downstairs and saw that the group of undead outside had been led away. He immediately sneaked to the corner and cut off the heads of the two dead undead. Then he carried their heads back to the building. Mason and Zach immediately retreated. He smiled and said, "It's okay. They are dead." Mason was horrified. "You, when did you become so bold?" "I'll adapt to it." Dean went back upstairs. According to the previous method, he split the heads of the two undeads. Because the heads of the two undeads were already cracked, he easily cut them open. As he expected, there was an identical dark blue orb inside. When cutting the third head, Dean suddenly thought of a problem. He immediately stopped the previous rough cutting method. Instead, he slowly opened the head along the cracked position of the skull. Soon, he saw the inside of the skull. As he expected, the brain tissue was extremely cold, as if it had been frozen. The dark blue ball was lying in the brain tissue package. However, probably because the skull was cracked, the brain tissue in the dark blue ball was somewhat damaged. Dean carefully searched for a while and soon understood that this dark blue ball was the main reason for controlling the actions of the undead. The so-called destruction of the head could kill the undead. There were two principles. The first was to destroy the central nervous system in the head so that the head could not control the body. The second was to destroy the connection between the dark blue ball and the brain tissue in the head. In short, this dark blue ball was like an ovary in the brain tissue. It was not necessary to destroy the head to kill the undead. As long as there was a strong shock, the dark blue ball would be shaken out of the ovary of the brain tissue. The dark blue ball would lose contact with the nerves in the ovary wall. Then the undead would stop moving. In other words, the undead would be killed. After understanding this point, Dean was more and more puzzled. What was this dark blue ball? Why would it grow in the brain of the undead? Was it a virus? So, wasn't this dark blue ball a virus condensation? Thinking of this, Dean immediately picked up the dark blue ball and wrapped it into a fist-sized ball. He slightly relaxed and then handed two to Mason and Zach. "This thing can absorb body temperature. It will help us to reduce body temperature. But don't hold it. It will absorb body temperature. It is best to put it in the backpack." Mason and Zach were surprised to see the two things wrapped in layers. Mason curiously asked, "What is this?" "I don't know." However, after the hunters killed the undead, they would dig out this thing from their heads. This shows that it should be very valuable. Otherwise, the hunters would not turn a blind eye to things like gold and dig out this thing. Dean said he had seen a lot of undead with their heads split open, but there was no such thing in the head. It was obvious that the hunters had picked it up. Mason was shocked. "You said that the hunters kill the undead for this." Chapter 57. This thing has a heat absorption characteristic. It proves that my previous speculation is correct. These undeads are likely to be affected by it. They will sense our body temperature and gradually gather here. The way they hunt is not by tracking the smell of blood, but by tracking the heat. Duddian secretly thought, Scott's team has a large number of people. The heat produced by them is even more amazing. It should attract more undeads. In other words, there's a very large number of undeads in the area number 8. This is by no means caused by the hunters. It is likely that they have moved from other areas. Dudian frowned as he thought of this. Previously, he had glanced at Scott's map. He remembered that there was a gray area near the area number 8. There were several green and blue areas, which were the hunting areas of other consortiums. Dudian said to Mason and Zach, "This thing can help us reduce our body temperature. We can get rid of the undead's tracking. However, we still can't get too close to them. We have to find a way to hunt an undead's and dig out the cold ball in its brain. Only then we can get rid of the undead's tracking." Mason was surprised. "With this thing, we can get rid of the undead's tracking. How can we hunt them? They are too strong. We are not their opponents." Zach asked. Dudian smiled. "We humans are not strong in fighting, but in wisdom. We can't confront them head-on, but we can use their lack of IQ to easily kill them." Easily? Zach and Mason looked at each other in a daze. 3 years of training taught scavengers how to search for prey in the wilderness and how to survive in a variety of environments. But it didn't teach them how to hunt, because that was the hunter's job. Therefore, although they had been trained, but faced with such a problem, Mason and Zach were completely at a loss. But compared to other ordinary children, they didn't panic and collapse. It was very rare. The simplest way is to use fire. Dudian smiled. "You go and find some cloth. As long as the cloth can be ignited, the more the better. I will replace Sham and lead them to a place. I will give you 10 minutes to gather the cloth downstairs." Mason and Zach's eyes lit up. They immediately guessed what Dean wanted to do. They quickly left the room and went to each floor to look for combustibles. Dean went back upstairs and saw that Sham was still tirelessly throwing stones. "You take a break. I'll do it." Sham replied, "No, I can do this kind of rough work. Whether we can leave this place or not, it's all up to you." Dudian laughed. "Mason and Zach are going to take care of it. They will be able to leave here soon. Everything is ready." "What do you mean?" Sham blankly asked. Dean shook his head and smiled. "Nothing. Everything is ready. I will finish the rest of the work. You go upstairs and find some stones. Don't empty this floor or it will collapse." Then he grabbed the gravel on the ground and looked at the wandering corpses at the entrance of the community. He suddenly found that the number of these corpses had increased by a few more. In the distance, there seemed to be a single corpse staggering over. Dean immediately grabbed the stone and threw it to the other side of the building, leading the undeads to the other side. 10 minutes later, Mason and Zach gathered the combustibles in the open space under the building and formed a circle. At this time, Dean continued to throw stones or glass into the open space in the center of the circle. The violent sound immediately attracted the attention of the group of undeads. They immediately staggered over and entered the center of the circle. At this time, Mason, who had received Dean's order in advance, immediately threw lit torches from the second floor. 4 or 5 torches tumbled down from the air and fell on the combustibles. Due to the relatively close height, only one of the 5 torches fell. The other 4 fell on the clothes. The flames burned along with the clothes and soon ignited the whole circle. The clothes and rotten wood furniture were burned together into a raging fire. The undeads in the center of the burning circle seemed to have an instinctive awareness to avoid the flames. They immediately ran out of the circle when the flames burned. Seeing this, Dean's face slightly changed. He immediately continued to throw stones and glass to attract the undeads with violent sound. However, the undead's awareness of fire was particularly strong. The sound couldn't attract them. Dean's face changed. He hurriedly shouted downstairs, "Bring the fire to them." Mason, Zach, and Sham were surprised for a moment. They immediately implemented the second set of backup plan prepared by Dean. That was to ignite the undeads. This plan was originally worried that the burning circle would not burn the undeads inside. They were ready to add fire to their bodies. But now it happened to come in handy. The 3 quickly picked up some bed sheets and other clothes on the ground and threw them downstairs to the undeads inside the burning circle. Soon the undeads were hit by the clothes. Although they were not injured, But when they ran out of the burning circle covered with bedsheets and quilts, they were ignited by the fire. Dean breathed a sigh of relief and watched quietly. It didn't take long for the flames to extinguish. There were 7 or 8 charred corpses lying in the burning circle. The rest of the undeads fell outside the burning circle. Some of them were not ignited by the flames. They fled hundreds of meters away and continued to stagger and approach. Dean immediately threw stones to lead them to the distance. Then he let Sham come over and continued to use sound to lead them away. He went downstairs and was ready to call Mason and Zach to collect the corpses. Suddenly, he saw one of the arms of the undeads. It seemed that it was slightly raised. He could not help but be shocked. Didn't the flames burn them? The bodies are burnt, but the dark blue ball on the head can control them. Dean's face changed. He called Mason and Zach to continue to throw combustibles to cover the bodies of the undeads to make the fire more vigorous. After burning for 7 or 8 minutes, Dean carefully observed the undeads for a while. He threw stones to the center of the undeads. There was no reaction. He was relieved and called Mason and Zach to collect the corpses. The 3 of them came downstairs. When Sham was leading the rest of the undeads away, they immediately used cloth and gloves to drag the charred corpses downstairs and cut off their heads. Mason and Zach gradually loosened their courage and tried to cut off the heads of the charred corpses. Soon, the heads of the charred corpses were cut off, a total of 8 heads. Dean directly cut open their heads and saw that the tissues in their skulls had softened. However, what surprised Dean was that the dark blue ball in their skulls was also melting. At this moment, it had melted from the size of a thumb to the size of a soybean, and the melted liquid was translucent like water. The color of the melted liquid was dark blue. This dark blue ball is afraid of high temperature? Dean was stunned. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.